All right, good evening, everybody. Calling to order our Tuesday, April 4th meeting. First, I'll start City Clerk with our roll call.
Mayor Kaylee Clark.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Amy Lamb.
Here.
Councilmember Karen Howe.
Here.
Councilmember Kent Treen.
Present.
Councilmember Pamela Stewart.
Here.
Councilmember Ratuja Indapure.
Here.
Councilmember Roisin O'Farrell.
Here.
All right. Councilmember Howe, if you'll lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you. I'll read the land acknowledgement statement this evening. We acknowledge that we are on the indigenous land of Coast Salish peoples who have reserved treaty rights to this land, specifically the Snoqualmie Indian tribe. We thank these caretakers of this land who have lived and continue to live here since time immemorial. Next, I will entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved. Second.
All right, any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, so first up, we have public comment. I don't see anyone in the room, so I think we'll go straight to online.
If you wish to provide public comment, please raise your hand. For those attendees joining by phone, please raise your hand by pressing *9. I see we have one person who has raised their hand, and I'll promote them at the moment. Mary Wichter.
Good evening. This is Mary Wichter. I wanted to speak to the housing.
You're muted, Mary.
It says unmute. Can you hear me?
Oh, let me check here.
It says I'm on mute.
Just a second, I think
Can you
we need
try
to turn
again,
it up.
Mary?
I'm still here. Can you hear me yet?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. Do I just need to be louder?
I just raised our volume up here. That should help.
Okay. So I'm Mary Wichter, been in Sammamish 22 years. Tonight I wanted to speak a little bit on the land use alternatives and housing. For the housing strategies, it does look like you're looking at community goals, guiding principles that reflect values goals, and also constraints. So I would like to ask that transfer of development rights definitely be used as to provide an alternative to building in areas that really should not be built. TDR should be attractive to use, encouraged, incentivized so that development can and will occur where it should go, where adequate infrastructure exists, rather than putting pressure in critical areas where development has been for so many years and often doesn't have the infrastructure that is needed and is very hard to build. I strongly suggest, in fact, I request that our very fine consultant from Framework, he has a bunch of maps and he's done really great colors and things, but I would like to have added to those a gray overlay, which will shade out the environmentally sensitive or critical areas. Those, there actually is a geologically hazardous map from 2003 that's reasonably correct that already exists, so he can just pull that overlay. He doesn't need to make anything new. There's also one for surface waters, lakes, streams, and wetlands. And then there's critical drainage areas that include not only the landslide hazard drainage area, but also the landslide hazard drains 2 area. And then there's an erosion hazard near sensitive water bodies. So those could be all picked. I also think that it's important to dither out or gray out places that just aren't going to develop, like parks and Sahali golf courses. In some of those, I don't think we're going to be building in the middle of the golf course. So those types of things could be removed. And then I think the maps will be a lot more useful. Maps are never 100% correct, but I love maps and they're often good guides. But if you're just missing really basic information or making it look like everything in this city is available, I believe that's misleading. So I hope you will strongly consider my request. It's also, I'm really glad to see that addressing local needs has been added. We've just been addressing the requirements from the regional and the state, and what we need locally is very important. But what is missing is the numbers that we need for that. Like, what is the range of numbers that we need to be able to include the shortages that we have for downsizing and the surpluses that we have, like we have too many single family homes and too many mansions. And we need the demographics too. I noticed that you mentioned seniors and empty nesters 6 or 7 times, and I'm grateful for that. But we need to know how many people really need those or want things to downsize in 1 or 2 bedroom units. I also attend regularly Sammamish Plateau Water and Sewer District meetings, and I believe a lot of their water operators don't live here or can't live here, and then they quit working after a while when they've been hired because they don't just want the commute. And I think those people would actually qualify at the 80 to 120% housing ranges. So I hope that you'll check with SPWSD Board President Lloyd Warren or the General Manager Jay Kraus, because they can give you some real data. I know there's also teacher salaries online, and probably police force firemen, those salaries are available too. And then other workers, I don't know how to get those numbers, but I'm sure that they're available.
Thank you so much.
I just wanted to say thanks for taking input tonight. I hope you'll use it and give updates.
We have one more caller that has raised their hand. I'll promote them right now. Paul Stickney.
Good evening, City Council. It's Paul Stickney, Sammamish. Yes, this is about housing land use, but it's how it affects everything else in positive ways. First, how big is big and how small is small? If you talk to an attorney, they would give a famous answer. It all depends. Well, I'm talking about that question in relation to what are housing needs and wants in our community over life. Second, sent in a recent comment today that I turned in a couple years ago, the Scarlet and the Emerald letters. The Scarlet letters are 2 A's, anecdotal and arbitrary. The Emerald letters are alleviate, add, and appropriate. Those are the ones to use to figure out the right housing mix for our community. Third, a critical question. What if the state and county were not mandating affordable housing this year? Would our city be considering notable housing supply number changes or not? Based on actions the last 24 years, unfortunately and sadly, I think that answer would be most likely no. And that's a shame, and it's cost us. Fourth, in the 1960s, a famous rock and roll band, Jim Morrison and the Doors, sang a song called 5 to 1. That's a great song. Sammamish has a 5 to 1 reality that really matters. Our local quantified housing shortage gap numbers now and over the cycle of life as of 2010 were over 5 times greater than the King County 2100 now, which is the affordable housing and external target for our community. Combining how big and small, the Scarlet and Emerald letters, state county mandates, and the magnitude of 5 to 1 local housing shortages, our community needs to act. An essential paradigm shift is needed to enrich, sustain, and stay Sammamish. Internal housing need gap numbers must be quantified, identified, addressed, and optimized. This has never happened in our community yet. Now is the time. It's long overdue. Unquantified housing strategies are like a fully loaded runaway truck without brakes, flying down a steep road. There's 2 options in that case. You can crash and burn or use a runaway escape lane to safely come to a screeching halt, unpack, and reload. Get all quantified housing gap numbers, reassess housing, then move forward with that new data. Doing this will change over 40 years of off-base housing supplies in our community and turn them into being genuine, beneficial, desirable, achievable, net positive, holistic, and sustainable for our community now and generations to come. As Captain Picard would say, make it so.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else that would like to give public comment tonight? Please raise your hand. I see 2 additional hands raised. James Eastman.
James Eastman, Sammamish, Washington. Hey, after the last meeting, I was a little disappointed. I'd spent 4 years on coming up with what I thought the council wanted. Was a plan to solve our infrastructure problems and to increase revenue within the city. And the feeling I get is we didn't want to talk about that or bring that up because we want to focus on housing, which is exact opposite of what the last council wanted in their town. So, but a part of me wonders, are we in the business of building Potemkin villages? That's a whole nother topic. But with this housing focus, I was looking at the data, and Paul's asked for the data for a while, and I know Ratuja, Pam, Roisin have mentioned getting the data, but it doesn't really seem like we're really going after the data, and that's the wants and the needs of our community. And what we seem to be focusing on is this new 2100 unit push. And looking at the data that's available in the packet, just from what I can see, first of all, on page 33, there's additional unit capacity. It shows 2 over my 100 acres. I'm thinking, man, I have only 2 units of capacity on 100 acres, and I have 10 vacant lots all by itself. So the math doesn't seem to add up there. But on page 34 in the 0 to 34 or 0 to 30 AMI, we show rent at about $1,000. Once you get to 80 to 100, it triples. And at Sky Sammamish, we built 30 units out of 160 were affordable. So 1 out of every 5. You build 4, you get 1 affordable. And I'm guessing that was probably at 80% AMI. So to get 30%, you got to triple that now. You got to do 12 units to get 1. So if you're going to build 12 units and you can get 1 at 30 AMI, and we need 2,100 units, that's 25,200 units we got to go build. And add the 2,100 affordable that you're going to build as the bonus. That's 27,000 units. That almost doubles our population in the city. But even with all that said, Town Center, I think the upper capacity constraint was it could hold 4,000 units. And that's starting from scratch with nothing built. This was Sky Sammamish. Based on those numbers, if you're going to tear down Trader Joe's and QFC, you're probably going to have to build 16, 17 market rate to get 1. So are we building another Potemkin village? Is this another 3 years of a facade just to lock up council time and come up with a plan that doesn't work? Or is the focus housing? Because we got to come up with something way better and really get the data. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll now promote the next caller. Paula Harper Christensen.
Right, my camera shows that it is on. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can't see you.
Well, I'm trying. I've got a little delay here. I apologize. I can, do you need to see me? For some reason, my camera's not coming on.
No, that's fine. You can go ahead and speak.
Okay. I'm sorry, City Council. I don't know what's wrong with the camera. Hello, City Council, and happy April. My name is Paula Harper Christensen, and it is the beginning of Distracted Driving Awareness. The Washington Traffic Safety Commission, the WTSC, will hold a special distracted driving law enforcement during this month, April 3rd through 10th, with law enforcement agencies statewide conducting emphasis patrols to watch distracted motorists. As an avid walker, I can attest that we have a distracted driving problem in Sammamish. Distracted driving is an act of driving while engaged in other activities that takes the driver's attention away from the road. In the state of Washington, it is against the law to hold your cell phone while you are driving. When I walk, I follow the rules, looking, crossing in crossroads, watching for cars, while always wearing a high-vis vest. I don't know if I'm on screen, but I'm wearing my vest tonight. And 2 times recently, during the middle of the day or during the morning in a crosswalk, both times near Discovery Elementary School, I had to scream and jump out of the way of a car speeding through a crosswalk, not looking because she was texting. Her eyes were on her phone, and it was drop-off time at the school. We all have things to learn from studying Distracted Driving Awareness Month, especially as we look for ways to reach a target 0, meaning no accidents. I also want to extend my so sincere gratitude to you, City Council, for granting an extension to Tent City 4 so they could stay a few weeks longer at Mary Queen of Peace while the permitting process was completed with the city of Issaquah for their new location. As a community, we did everything right so all the moving pieces could come together. It took 1 city council, 2 cities, 3 churches, and many dedicated humanitarians and the dear residents of Tent City 4. I'm happy to report that the move took place over the weekend and the residents are now comfortable in their new location at Our Savior Lutheran Church, which is co-hosted by Spirit of Peace.
Thank you.
Well done, City Council. Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, is there anybody else that would like to give public comment? Please raise your hand. I don't see any other commenters. Back to you, Mayor.
All right, thank you. Next up, we have an executive session. It's scheduled for 10 minutes, pending litigation pursuant to RCW 42.30.1101I. No action is expected after. And so do you think just by 7, like it's 12 minutes?
Sure, let's do 12 minutes and
Cool.
come back at 7.
Great. Thank you. We'll be back. All righty. Good? All right. Okay, so next up, we have the consent calendar. Deputy Mayor Lamb, I believe you have an item.
Yes, I'd like to pull item number 3 from the consent calendar. That's the contract supplemental agreement for communications program consultant services.
All right, so we'll just put that at the end of new business. So I will entertain a motion to approve the consent items 1, 2, and 4.
So moved. Second.
All right, moved and seconded. Any other, Councilmember Trine? Wrong button, okay. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? All right. Okay, so next up we have a proclamation, Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Councilmember Indapure.
Thank you. Sexual Assault Awareness Month is in April 2023. So, whereas Sexual Assault Awareness Month calls attention to the fact that sexual violence is widespread and impacts every person in the community, and SAM, Sexual Assault Awareness Month, aims to raise public awareness about sexual violence and educate communities about prevention. And whereas individual and community impacts of sexual violence are rooted in and compounded by racial, gender, sexual orientation, and other forms of oppression as Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, people living in poverty, LGBTQ people, elders, people with disabilities, and other people targeted by oppression as affected by sexual violence in significant and complex ways. And whereas rape is amongst the most underreported crimes for reasons that include victims' fear of being disbelieved or further traumatized within systems designed to support them, and additional barriers such as language, immigration status, gender bias, and systemic racism further oppress and silence victims. And whereas negative impacts of sexual violence trauma on men, women, children, and youth include fear, concern for safety, symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, injury, and missed work or school. And whereas more than 1 in 4 non-Hispanic Black women, 29%, in the United States were raped in their lifetime, more than 4 in 5 American Indian and Alaska Native women, which is 84.3%, have experienced violence in their lifetime, and 1 in 3 Hispanic women, which is 34.8, report unwanted sexual contact in their lifetime. And whereas 32.9% of adults with intellectual disabilities have experienced sexual violence, and 47% of all transgender people have been sexually assaulted within their lives. And whereas King County is home to many organizations that provide culturally and linguistically specific services for survivors from various racial, ethnic, faith, and cultural communities, survivors who are immigrants and refugees, survivors who are LGBTQ, and survivors with disabilities. And these culturally specific services are critical to effectively respond to the needs and barriers many survivors face. And whereas working together as a community, we can alleviate the trauma of sexual violence by ensuring supportive resources that are available to all survivors while standing up to harmful attitudes and behaviors that contribute to sexual assault. Now, therefore, it be resolved that Mayor Kelly Clark and the Sammamish City Council join the advocates and communities across King County in taking action to prevent sexual violence by standing with survivors and proclaiming April 2023 as a Sexual Assault Awareness Month. Together, we commit to a safer future for all our children, young people, adults, and family in our community. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All righty. We have a David Pyle update.
Right, good evening, Council. David Pyle, Department of Community Development. While we get set up here, I'll go ahead and do a quick update on our major projects in community development. The first major project is the comprehensive plan. On your consent agenda tonight, you had an item updating the contract where we'll be basically setting up the project through 2024. We've been able to evaluate all the costs and feel confident that we have all of the funding needed to get through 2024. So thank you for that. We are working through our housing and land use elements, and you will be seeing meetings moving forward that will be presenting different alternatives to you for consideration. We are continuing to evaluate public comment as received in order to understand what additional points of data that we might need, such as comment tonight about adding mapping layers. That is one we are planning to do. We haven't gotten there yet, but we are definitely looking forward to that as it helps refine the numbers. With regard to the climate action planning work, we are ramping up the climate action plan community advisory group. The first meeting for that group will be next Wednesday, April 12th. I'll be sending out an agenda to all of the participants for that this Friday, and we'll be including the charter, some questions we want them to think about before the meeting, and some background information. Regarding the Housing Action Plan, the next meeting for the Housing Action Plan is the Planning Commission meeting this Thursday. So on April 6th, the Planning Commission will be considering the Housing Action Plan, and we'll be holding a public hearing on that prior to eventually making recommendation to the City Council. So if the public is interested in the Housing Action Plan, the next visible step will be this Thursday, April 6th with the Planning Commission. Please note that is an early start meeting that starts at 5:30 because that is a very full agenda, and we want to make sure we have adequate time to get through the meeting material. So that is the update this round. I'll make sure to come back with some additional details the next time we have this update. It's been a busy few weeks for us trying to get a few things out the door, so I didn't have a time to pull together the presentation that I would have liked to, so I apologize for that.
Any questions, Council?
I did have a
Councilmember
question.
Napure? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So, David, would you recommend that, actually, before I did, will the presentations that you give to the Planning Commission, are you planning to give us also the same presentation a few weeks later?
Yes, however, it will be additive. So we will be learning from our conversation with the Planning Commission and from public comment delivered to the Planning Commission, and we hope to add additional information to presentation that you will then receive. However, if you have opportunity to watch the Planning Commission meeting, that's always great. Even after the fact, when the video is published, that's also very helpful.
Yep. Thanks.
All right, I don't see any other hands. Okay, so it looks like we're moving straight into new business. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Where's that picture? That picture, David. Yeah. All right, please continue. Yes.
So David Pyle, Department of Community Development, and tonight I have with me Jeff Arango from Framework. We will be presenting to you some land use alternatives regarding housing numbers and how we might, some different angles on using housing, different tools and strategies to help meet some of our housing requirements and also address some community needs and wants. Jeff?
Yep. Great, thank you, David. Good evening, Mayor, City Council members. Jeff Arango with Framework. And the presentation tonight is a modified version of the presentation we gave a few weeks ago where we introduced the housing strategies. We've now gone ahead and quantified those in a range in terms of what capacity increases would be as a result of those different strategies. And so we'll be presenting those to you this evening. We also have made substantial progress around some of the analysis for local needs related to the housing element. We have a couple of slides with a few charts to preview that. We have a full draft of a memo that's currently undergoing internal review, and then we'll be able to pass that along once the staff has reviewed and approved it. So again, we'll preview some of that this evening. Okay, so meeting goals, provide additional data and housing capacity estimates for housing strategies, again, addressing the growth target and affordable housing as well as local needs. Final affirmation of the land use principles. So at the last meeting, we introduced some land use principles. We got some great feedback. We've made some revisions, so just want to make sure that we're hitting the target there. These will be used to guide decision-making on land use alternatives. When we reference land use alternatives, I mean the full package of strategies that form actual alternatives, which would be one of our next steps, as well as the selection of a preferred alternative. And then confirm the housing strategies for inclusion in the land use alternatives. So similar questions that we asked last time, except we have more information and data. So again, are there any strategies we think are really suitable for the community? Are there some that are less attractive? Are there some we might want to modify how we approach those? So real quick, Growth Management Act is kind of the fundamental framework with which we're planning under. We have the Vision 2050 and multi-county planning policies, and then the requirements from King County. Those all feed into our requirements for the comp plan update, and it's informed by guidance from the state as well as the region. These two maps, the one on the left shows the existing zoning for the city. On the right is the additional unit capacity, which is largely taken from the buildable lands work that King County has done. These estimates do factor in environmentally critical areas, so those are reduced. And we can certainly, as David said, do a map with an overlay. But most of the buildable lands maps do not show critical areas because it can make the map a little bit busy. So I would suggest having a couple different versions of the map. Also, there are often a lot of nuances around critical areas. Like even if a parcel is entirely encumbered, there's something called reasonable use, which would allow some measure of development. So those types of nuances are reflected in these numbers here. So another reminder slide from last year, this is essentially the growth target. And just to clarify, where the growth target comes from, you know, the Office of Financial Management does a projection for the entire state saying we need 1 million homes over the planning period. Those then get filtered down to the counties, and then the counties filter those down to the cities. So theoretically, the entire housing needs of the state for the 20-year planning period is reflected in that number. That's not to say that means there are no local needs, but again, based on that entire projection of the state, it's accounted for in each city's growth targets. And at the bottom, you can see the different income levels that correspond with each of the different affordability levels and housing types. So again, we are focused both on meeting the growth target requirements, which I feel confident that we have a good strategy, but there's still a lot of work to do to figure out the details. I thought some of the comments around, ratios of market rate housing to affordable units is something that we need to consider for sure. I think there's a way to do it without quite as high of a ratio as some of those that are mentioned, but it's definitely something we're going to continue to work on, as well as addressing, local needs within the community. So some of the findings that we included in the memo in your packet related to housing for local needs. The first bullet describes what I just said previously. Again, all of the growth in the state is accounted for in those targets. Periodic updates are an opportunity to define local needs and desires through a mix of analysis, engagement, communication, and data analysis, and we intend and are actively working on all of those avenues. In our professional view, defining a very specific additional housing, local housing target beyond that mandated by GMA is not necessary to address local needs. There are a lot of assumptions that go into land use modeling, and it can be quite unpredictable in terms of how it will actually play out. And I think looking at it in terms of creating opportunities is really the way to do it. And I think there's additional analysis that can help inform that, but there's a lot we already know from the work of the Housing Action Plan, the work we've been doing on our comprehensive plan, and just our local knowledge of the community around where the gaps are. They're pretty glaring, and I think a number of the strategies we're going to present tonight very clearly help to define those gaps, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Yeah, the next bullet, in terms of what those gaps are, I mean, it's simply stated there's predominantly one type of housing in Sammamish. It's generally larger units and generally not affordable. And that's really the gaps that we need to address on multiple levels. I think I addressed the next one down. And then the last bullet, which we have a slide later to talk about this, is that implementation strategies will continue after the plan adoption and will likely need refinement to achieve desired outcomes based on learned experience. So essentially, we're trying to create the capacity to accommodate the growth in association with the growth targets, but there's likely to be additional work after that we'll have to do towards implementation. And again, I'll refer back to that later in the presentation. So now I'm just going to preview, I think it's 3 slides here on some of the housing analysis that we've done to identify local needs. And this one kind of speaks to what I had just said a moment ago around housing sizes and local needs. So on the left-hand side, this looks at the number of bedrooms to the number of people. So how many people are living in a home versus how many bedrooms it has. And if you go over on the right side, it shows the sort of surplus and deficit based on typical household sizes, right? And this, just also keep in mind that this doesn't take into account personal preference, right? The data may say you live alone and you may want to live in a small apartment, but you may in fact have a 4-bedroom home and have no intention of moving. So take that into consideration. But when you look at it purely from the numbers, you can see that there's quite a deficit in smaller 1- and 2-bedroom units, quantified roughly at 1,500 units of 1-bedroom units, 1-bedrooms or studios, 4,300 units for 2 bedrooms. And then the reverse as you get into the larger units where there's a surplus of 2,000 and about 3,600 respectively. So I think that, starts to get at what some of the local needs might be in terms of matching housing sizes to household sizes. This next one looks at identifying local needs, so it's housing affordability by income band. We've attempted to do it for both renter and for owner. The guidance from the state that was recently released stated that they're not advising cities to focus too much on owner housing for a variety of reasons. One is it's really complicated to estimate those needs because there's such a variety of factors that go into ownership housing. Is there, you may have a low income but high wealth. How much down payment goes into it, so on and so forth. And I think there's an assumption for those that have already purchased homes that there's some, measure of equity there, depending on when they purchased it. So with that said, we still took a look at it as best we could. So the top one looks at renter, and it's basically looking at household incomes within those income bands shown at the bottom of the graph, and then number of households within there. And you can show that there's generally a fairly even match, and maybe that is because the limited stock of housing in those income bands, really limits the number of households in those income bands to be able to live here. But with that said, we do show for renter households a deficit of about 47 units in 0 to 30, 5 in 30 to 50, and 32 in 50 to 80. So again, that's substantially less than the county analysis and our allocation, and part of that is because they're looking at their targets based on the entire county and not just the local community. But I think this is an interesting data point. And then the other one on the owner slide does show a pretty substantial deficit in the 100% plus ownership housing, 434 units. So I think that does, again, inform some local needs beyond the 0 to 80% AMI that is in our growth target. And then last one in terms of the preview is looking at identifying local needs, estimating workforce. So we looked at workers traveling into Sammamish. So these would be ones that do not, workers that do not live here. And basically matching up those incomes, we would find a need of 422 in the 0 to 30% AMI, 1930 in the 50 to 80, and almost 4,000 in the 100 to 120%. This might be one where we also, want to set a target. I mean, taking these numbers and saying we want to provide 100% of these units, while maybe a worthwhile goal, may not, be realistic nor match the actual demand because people have other considerations of where they choose to live. But with that said, I think this does highlight a potential need for workforce housing. And again, selecting a reasonable target might be a good way to go. So land use principles, I won't go through these in details, but just to say that we've taken your feedback, we've tracked it. I believe we gave the matrix in the packet that responds to the changes that came out of those meetings. So I think they're all generally the same number. I think we maybe added one to highlight the need to incorporate local needs. But again, things like being responsive to the requirements, respecting historic land use patterns, being additive of single-family neighborhoods for things like middle housing, not looking at strategies or approaches that would support significant redevelopment or disruption of some of the single-family neighborhoods, leveraging infrastructure, incentivizing redevelopment areas with impervious surface like the existing centers, reflecting housing needs of local residents, successful zoning practices for diverse housing types, increasing densities over sufficient land area to promote deep affordability, walkability to amenities. That's kind of one of our core strategies around middle housing. And then promoting equitable access to amenities, features, and services. Responsive to existing constraints and future opportunities, things like critical areas, transfer development rights, minimizing displacement, which is one of the things that we need to address as part of the housing element. And then making sure that we're monitoring and reacting to what the data is telling us and making changes where we may need to. So now we'll get into the specific land use and housing strategies. So starting first with the strategies for compliance and then those that are more targeted to local needs. So first one actually is sort of more related to more local needs. But it would be looking at potentially creating some new centers within the community. And I think what we've talked about previously is perhaps setting the policy framework for that to happen. And it could happen through a variety of different measures, designation by the city, proposal from maybe a private developer to incorporate a neighborhood center as part of a development project. And this, I think, is part and parcel with the middle housing strategy, which is all about housing around amenities and services, and could help inform our housing strategy as well along the way. So again, I think this is something that will likely play out over time, but we can kind of set the stage for here. So increased capacities in the center, including the town center and the other centers outside of its border. There is a baseline capacity of 1,284 units in the town center and 606 units within the other centers. And that's based on a density of about 18 units per acre in the centers outside of the town center. So we've gone through and quantified what would it look like if there was redevelopment of the centers at, say, 80 units per acre and then 100 units per acre. That would increase the capacity to 3,200 units and up to possibly 3,800 units. So a fairly significant increase there. And as we showed in the previous presentation, and it might be coming up, there are some examples of projects in Sammamish built on a net basis of around 100 units per acre. So this would allow, again, mid-rise housing, which would primarily be the type of housing that we would be looking at to meet those deep affordability targets. And it results in the highest amount of capacity in the city. And these are those examples I just referenced: Sky Apartments, 96 dwelling units per acre. And I think it's also important to kind of focus maybe more on building typologies than density, because density is just a simple calculation, and an apartment building could have 3 acres behind it on the same lot, and that would lower the density, but yet the experience from a pedestrian is essentially the same. So these buildings are all, I think, fairly similar regardless of what the density numbers are telling us. The next strategy, again, related to meeting the growth targets, is what we're calling bonus parcels. So this would allow mid-rise affordable housing on parcels owned by religious county and county and the city, religious institutions. Things like potentially the Park and Ride, which be interesting to see if we could find some data on its current use. I went by it the other day. It seemed quite lightly parked at the time, and there's some really good examples of redevelopment and integration of transportation facilities, mobility hubs at some of the publicly owned park and rides, including by King County. So this baseline is between 0 and 185 units, so not a lot, but sometimes these properties do occur in locations where some residential development's already allowed. And based on our assumptions of between 40 and 60 dwelling units per acre, we could increase the capacity to from 1,500 to 2,300, so getting up substantially. These projects would typically be delivered as 100% affordable housing, so we wouldn't have the issue of ratios like you would in an inclusionary program. So that is a little bit different. And there are some really great examples of this already happening in the region. And these would be suitable, again, to the housing that's targeted to the deeper affordability, so mid-rise buildings, courtyard apartments, walkable apartments, perhaps opportunity for mass timber buildings, point access blocks, which are single stair, smaller scale buildings, So lots of, a few different potential types there that could fit. And these are some of the examples from St. Luke's Lutheran Church, and you can see the apartments there in the rear. On the upper right is a project near the South Kirkland Park and Ride, and then down below is Compass Broadview, which is part of the Luther Memorial Church. Okay. Next strategy gets into some of the ones that are more targeted to local needs. First one looks at middle housing. Again, these are things between apartment buildings and single-family homes. Not a panacea of affordability, but definitely typically more affordable than a single-family home. The two maps speak to two potential different strategies based on walk distance from amenities. So this looks at proximity from centers, transit, schools, and parks. And basically, if you're within those colored blobs, you would essentially have opportunity to develop middle housing. And this analysis is network-based, so it's based on connections, road connections, and pedestrian connections. So it's possible that this type of zoning could actually spur interest in making new connections as part of private development. So if you were a parcel maybe just outside the boundary and you made a trail connection and now you're included in that boundary, you would have the benefit of that zoning. So what I like about that is it really starts to tie together a number of issues in the city and things we've heard from the community, not only around housing needs, but transportation needs and street connectivity and things like that. So that is potentially pretty exciting. And then the map on the right just looks at the same analysis, but with a half-mile walk shed. We could also vary that. We could do half-mile from some facilities and a quarter-mile from others. So there's some opportunities to fine-tune that. Oh, sorry. Okay, and then these are the numbers. So baseline within the quarter-mile walk shed, 515 units, and that is based just on the parcels that were identified in the buildable lands analysis as being redevelopable. So we kind of started with those. We could go back in and modify our assumptions and assume that there's more parcels that might be eligible, but I'm not sure that will be necessary. So in the quarter-mile walk shed, low of 1,648 units, high of 2,500 units roughly at 18 units an acre. And then for the half mile, you get 2,500 at 12 and 3,900 at 18. And again, this would include things like small multiplexes, cottage clusters, townhouses, duplexes, those types of things. And there's some example photos there on the right-hand side. Another strategy would be to allow cottage housing on larger parcels within the city. We have not done a very fine-grained analysis, but we did identify parcels half acre or larger that could potentially support some infill that wouldn't even necessarily require, or could accommodate maintaining the existing single-family home. And there may actually be some incentives if that was a goal we wanted. You can maybe give another unit if they preserve the existing single-family home. We've seen some communities take that approach. We're assuming density allowances of up to 12 units per acre. I do have quite a bit of experience with cottage housing when I was the planning director in Langley, and they had one of the first cottage housing codes and have a number of projects up there have been very successful, and there's lots of great examples around the region. So that results in a baseline of 353 under current zoning, up to 8 dwelling units an acre, 787, and high up to a little over 1,100 or just under 1,200. So, smaller numbers, but still, fairly substantial, and I think, would really fit in well in some of the neighborhoods within Sammamish and are very complementary to single-family homes. There is potential to tie some affordability to cottage housing projects. Maybe a unit or two could be required to be affordable at moderate levels. So that's something we could look at in terms of a requirement or an incentive program. And then there are some example photos on the right, Kirkland, Bainbridge Island, which has some great cottage housing projects, and then Healdsburg, California. And you can see, again, they look very much like single-family homes. They're just smaller and, again, typically planned around common open space and common parking. Lots of nice landscaping and some great social spaces. So this slide's connected to the first slide I showed around new neighborhood centers. These are a couple of examples. Rolling Bay and Bainbridge Island, you may be familiar with, but again, these are meant to not really be like the existing centers, but much more smaller in scale, more neighborhood serving, perhaps, very walkable, those sorts of things. So again, we'll see how this plays out, but this could be a potential strategy to provide more amenities and services, deeper into neighborhoods in Sammamish if that's desirable. And I think I covered most of this. There's some examples there, including some townhouses. Again, opportunity maybe to tie some affordability levels. And then planned residential development. This was, again, a topic that we took on in Development Regs Phase 2, and the Planning Commission felt like this should be kind of deferred to a future process, so we're bringing it back up for consideration. But PRDs essentially allow more flexibility in kind of your site planning and unit mixes. There can be incentives for public benefits to get better outcomes. Projects like this could include a small commercial component, or maybe even designating a small neighborhood center. So it's a tool that's been around a long time, but can be effective. Again, we haven't done a very fine-grained analysis. Very difficult to estimate who's going to want to do a PRD when. So we haven't done specific capacity estimates, but we did identify some parcels that are over 5 acres, which when we had drafted, done a preliminary draft of the PRD code as part of Development Regs Phase 2, that was what we had sort of written into it in terms of a minimum size. So again, I think another good tool that could help us address local needs for sure. And these are some examples, 2 from Lake Chelan on the Lookout. If you've been over there, it's up on one of the hillsides. It's quite nice. And then another new town in Missouri there. They can take on kind of new urbanist type styling, but they can also take other forms. And, we could have an opportunity to prescribe the sort of look and feel that we're desiring in the community. Accessory dwelling units, again, these have been allowed in Sammamish for a while. We did look at some recent, there it is, historical ADU permits, and you can see there has not been a lot of them developed. One of the issues is that a lot of the houses have been put on very small lots. So if you're looking to do a detached ADU, that's problematic. You could do a carve out, but that's kind of hard with architecture and stuff sometimes. So one of the things we did do in Development Regs Phase 2 is we basically right-sized the home to the lot so that every new lot that's created would have room for an ADU. And even went so far as exempting that from the square footage limits. So we do have some new pretty powerful incentives, but some communities have done things like allowed 2 ADUs on larger lots, so that could be something we could look at. Again, very difficult to estimate. We just highlighted parcels that have an existing single family home and could lend themselves to having an ADU. Baseline at the current rate over the 20-year period would be 120. If we doubled that, we'd be at 240. What if we established a target of 5%? We added incentives and streamlined permitting and maybe, things like pre-approved ADU plans, maybe we would, help get to a higher target there. So I think there's some opportunities to incentivize it, but, it's a lot of communities are struggling with production of ADUs. So Sammamish is not alone there. Again, could address some moderate levels of affordability. I don't know as we would have or recommend a formal affordability requirement, but I think they, tend to be by their nature more affordable. Definitely, I think something we could try to amplify through this process. So when you put all of that together, these charts show the combined capacity of each of these strategies based on the high and low range. As I said at the previous meeting, there is some overlap with these strategies. So once we get into the formal alternatives and we're sort of matching these up, we will have to go through a process of kind of refining that. But I think this gives us a really good look at what these strategies would potentially produce from a capacity standpoint. So those are the numbers. And this amazing chart here syncs up the land use strategies with the housing strategies, right? So if you go to the column, each of the numbers, sorry, these are the HAP strategies. We have another one that's like that. So if you look at the HAP strategies on the left, and then you crosswalk that with the housing strategies, you can see where the housing strategies that we developed as part of the comp plan are complementary to the HAP strategies.
It also shows which strategies would address compliance and which would also address community need. So those that are in red address compliance. Those that are in green address community need.
Thank you, David. Okay, so moving on. Okay, this is the slide I wanted to talk about regarding implementation, because I think all of us have had probably thoughts in our minds of, how are we actually going to meet some of these affordable housing requirements? How are we going to make this happen? And I think, I feel like we have a really good set of strategies that can help get us there. But we just wanted to illustrate from a timeline standpoint how this will sort of play out, right? And so if you think of the comp plan as a 20-year, planning program, really, it's not just writing the plan. That's kind of the start of it. But then there's the whole implementation phase. So you can see in the green bar on the left, that's sort of the time we have to produce the plan, which is pretty short. And then the implementation phase kind of starts after that. We have new reporting requirements. So at year 5, we're going to have to produce this report. And we're going to learn from that. And so there's a number of things that we might do afterwards that will also help with implementation. We might look at calibrating an inclusionary zoning program, which can be very complex and needs to be market-based. There's lots of communities that put in inclusionary zoning programs but have not seen the production. We may want to do sub-area planning. So we may want to do sub-area plans for each of the centers, and that would help refine our land use strategy and our strategy around affordable housing. We'll want to have further consultations with developers and property owners, including affordable housing providers. May result in things like development agreements, tailoring incentive programs, refinement and support for the TDR marketplace, design review, green building code, which is something I know the city's been considering, affordable housing partnerships. So that all kind of starts and continues to take place after the adoption of the plan. Then you have the monitoring, results of the monitoring, refinement, and you have sort of some loops there. And then within that 20-year period, at the 10-year mark, you're going to have to redo the plan again. So then it kind of starts over, which is kind of confusing because it's like, it's a 20-year plan, but we really only use it for 10 years and then we update it. So that's kind of how it's going to play out. And I just wanted to bring this up to say that as much as I'd love to say we're going to adopt the plan, it's perfect, everything's going to happen, that's probably not going to happen. So we need to be prepared for that. And it's okay if there's some details that we're going to need to figure out after. I think that's in this planning cycle that every community is going to be going through that. All right, so some of the findings. Again, I think the city has a reasonable path and options to demonstrate compliance with the growth targets. I think 6 months ago, we weren't really sure. And there's still a lot of details to figure out, but I think we do have the start of some good strategies. Several housing strategies can address specific local needs determined by additional data analysis, which we've begun, low and moderate income worker housing, smaller unit sizes, median income housing for renters and owners. Again, we'll have to do continued work after adoption in order for the implementation. Housing element, which we'll be working on, will be consistent with the Housing Action Plan strategies, address requirements of the Growth Management Act, including recent and any newly adopted legislation, which we're tracking. And then several housing strategies reflect potential anticipated changes under state legislation, including House Bill 1110 related to middle housing, lot splitting bill, which my understanding is that may not be going forward, and then House Bill 1337, which deals with ADUs. All right, so some of the questions for the council, given the capacity estimates, are there land use and housing strategies you think are not worth being considered in developing the land use alternatives? Is there anything we should take out? And the other thing to keep in mind is that if you include it in the alternatives, then we can kind of look at it and provide more information. So it doesn't mean if you're putting it in an alternative, you are saying we need to definitely do this. I think you're just saying we want to put it in for further study. And we may decide it's a great idea or not a great idea or some combination of that. Does the council understand the relationship between how these numbers demonstrate capacity to account for the required housing allocation and how they will peripherally benefit other community housing goals? And then I think, if left to our own devices, we would recommend probably 2 land use alternatives. One that's the baseline, which is typical to just kind of have a comparative, and then another alternative that includes either all or some combination of the land use alternatives, so we can see what it looks like collectively. We can do transportation analysis and those sorts of things, find out sort of what the max is, and then, refine from there. Our preferred alternative can be any sort of combination of those strategies. Of course, we have to demonstrate compliance with the requirements, but beyond that, we have a lot of local decision-making opportunity. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to the mayor, and happy to answer questions.
Councilmember Howe.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for the presentation, very thorough and very detailed, which I really appreciate. So I have a couple of quick questions to start. My first one has to do with extremely low income versus Section 8 versus 0 to 30 AMI. So I see numbers for a 0 to 30 AMI in our targets. Do we have Section 8?
I think it would all be, and I can check on this. I believe it would already be reflected in the income bands that are already there.
You would think 0 to 30, but that's what I wasn't really sure.
Yeah, my assumption is that it would be reflected in the 0 to 30, and then there is also an allocation for supportive housing, which is outside of that. So I'll confirm that, but that's my understanding.
Because to some extent, I do feel like we talk about subsidized housing as an option, but we don't really understand what the bands of subsidy could actually be, or how it gets managed, or who would manage that, or just how that process works necessarily. I don't know that we're...
Well, typically when you're talking, it's a good question. Typically when you're talking about affordable housing, it's usually a restriction on the cost, right?
Right.
Whereas Section 8 is sort of a
actually managed.
Subsidy, so it's a little bit different. But let me go circle back with our team and get you a better answer.
Yeah, because it's the housing authority, I think, that does have to actually manage that.
Yep.
And it's quite a process.
Yep.
But I just want to try to make sure I understand that.
Yep.
And I'm not going to get the slides right here probably, but I think on slide 13 of yours, maybe.
I can't see the numbers.
If you've got, it had to do with just actually even something that came in as far as public comment about the concept of change, that we're trying to keep the character, but there's like this one sentence about, and not have things change or something like that. And forgive me, I don't have the right slide for you here.
Okay, sorry.
But I can actually send it to you so that you do it. I'm recommending we just strike the last half of the sentence.
Okay.
And the reason why is because I got so excited I lost my glasses. I do think that the community needs to understand that change is part and parcel of what is happening here, and that we'll maintain a feel that may be consistent with what is today, but it will look different in the future. And I think that we have a responsibility to prep. One of the key pieces of advice actually that we got from Redmond when we met with the city councilor from Redmond was if they really, 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 really wished that they had spent the money and done a scale model of what they were proposing so that people could see in three-dimensional space exactly how this is going to impact them and what it could kind of look like. And I super think it's a great idea to could we, should we, can we look at as we, get more forward on our thinking here. I think we can actually start to draw something that's not two-dimensional, but get it into a three-dimensional space.
Yeah.
And it would be tremendous.
Well, we've actually been doing that at a small scale for some of our other clients around housing action plan implementation projects. So, for example, and we're happy to share some examples, but like one of the examples is for the city of Auburn, where they were looking at middle housing because it was a strategy in their adopted plan, but they, didn't understand or wanted to know, like, what would it look like? So we went in and we identified 4 or 5 different areas. We sort of did a context analysis of the block, how big are the lots, where are the houses placed, and then what would it look like if, you had an infill townhouse or and it was all done 3-dimensionally. It's not a physical model like in front of you, but that's absolutely something that we could do, and I think is very beneficial. And we've found that it's really helped people kind of understand it, and we haven't gotten a lot of pushback, around that. And I think both the planning commissions and the city council that we've met with have found it very helpful. So.
Well, it helps. Scale is very hard for people to get.
Yeah.
And so, and just their relationship to that space. So it would be terrific to think about how we could do that. Councilmember Stewart had a good idea of doing it with Legos, which I really liked, because that could be a wonderful project.
Yeah, we've done that.
My other question.
Can I jump in and ask a question, a clarifying question? If we could go to the slide, just because I want to track these. These are really important to us in moving forward, that we get the guiding principles correct. And you had made a suggestion that we delete the latter half of principle number 2.
The intense. Well, I was suggesting complementary to existing and historic land use and zoning patterns. I wasn't really sure that you needed to have a whole bunch of more words after that.
So what I would ask at this point is if there's a proposed change, that maybe you could vote on it and give us firm direction, so that we are fully aware of what the intent of the council is and what these should say.
Okay. Should we do that now, or should we do that after everyone's comments? Because the thing is that everyone. We'll have
we can do it
comments.
after, but what I do want to make sure of is that moving forward is that we have very clear direction.
Gotcha.
So that we're not challenged later as, well, what did they really say, or what did they mean? We really appreciate clear direction. Sorry for the interruption. I just wanted to track that.
No, not at all. I'm glad you found that slide, but that I was really suggesting that we be complementary to existing historic land use and zoning patterns. And then I would probably take a look at just if there was anything else I felt absolutely had to be there. I actually think that the intent is right there, complementary to historic land use and zoning patterns. I'm actually comfortable with that. And the reason is it's stated, which is, hey, we're going to be as consistently fitting in with our environment as we humanly can. We're not, suddenly going, space age modern with every, thing that we do, and suddenly shooting up 20 stories or something, but fitting into our environment. Mm-hmm. And my objection really is that that idea of an urban intensity of the city do not change. I don't know that we can hold true to that. So that was my point. And I would like other people to have a chance to think about that rather than voting on it right this second. Sure. And actually, so if we could hold that thought for this particular slide, but we'll come back. And then my next question has to do with, I can't get the numbers right, but we did talk about in these slides about, in particular, bonus commercial space. So if you were to advance like 5 slides or something, in order to get a different number for your affordable units, if I recall. Yes, bonus commercial space to incentivize more affordable housing. Is there any rationale or any data, anything to tell me that we need bonus commercial space and that we would be successful in doing something with bonus space?
Well, I think that's something that we could explore as part of the economic development element and some of the outreach and some of the analysis we would do there. It's a good point. I think in addition to the bonus commercial space, you'd have to have some sort of bonus or upzoning, which is the numbers that we provided. That's probably more likely to provide the offset, but to the extent that it's desirable for the property owners, they see market value in bonus commercial space, I think we should continue to consider it. I mean, the one thing I will say is that for a city of Sammamish's size, the area zoned commercial is pretty small. What we typically find in other communities is that they overzone commercial because they think it's better for the economics of the city.
Economically, sure.
Because it's, residential typically or sometimes doesn't pay for the cost of services, not always, but so a lot of times we go into communities like they have commercial zoning everywhere and they've overzoned it. I think in the case of Sammamish, it's something we should at least keep on the table and be open to it just because you can see that commercial space is at such a limited capacity.
So example, town center. The town center STCA has indicated that they would like additional commercial space.
Oh, they
that
have.
they would benefit from some additional commercial space. That they're
Over 88,000 square feet.
that their models show that there is additional demand beyond what's there now. What's available. And one thing you could do in exchange for that additional commercial space is say, hey, if you would like X amount of commercial space, then you need to provide X amount of units in the 0 to 30% AMI or 30 to 50% AMI. Think about also in terms of the bucket analogy, where a builder needs, they need to fill the bucket to build a project. And sometimes there are incentives you can offer to help them get to top the bucket off. Where you're stacking things, like you start off with inclusionary zoning, then you add on top of that transfer development rights, then you add on top of that partnerships, then you add on top of that some bonus commercial whereby if they could get some profitable space out of the project, that they in turn would build some deeper affordability, more deeply affordable units. So when you think about bundling and stacking incentives and tools, that's where the bonus commercial really comes into play at the end of the project to get it across the finish line.
And for me, it really is like, is there demand? So if there's demand, then that's tremendous because heaven knows I would like that revenue source. Okay, and I'm prepared to cede to others. Thank you so much.
No problem. This is coming back May 16th,
I believe so.
right?
Yeah.
Because I was just thinking, we can vote on things tonight, too. I just didn't know as far as like directional things, but Deputy Mayor Lamb?
I just had a couple of comments. Going back to what Councilmember Howe was talking about, land use policy number 2, I'd just like to strike the last 3 words, do not change, because it will change. To what degree, we don't know. So I would like to change those words to adapts as needed. So that's my first comment. My other comments were just going through the memo. It appears that middle housing will most likely, it will be moderately affordable to 80 to 100% AMI, which is kind of unfortunate. And so with all the targets being at the much lower end, our requirements for affordable housing is what, at 10% right now? Is it 10, 15%? Like, could we, 10%? Like, could we not require, instead of incentivizing the lower brackets when a development goes in? Because I saw that word kind of repeated, that we could get a few more units at the lower end by incentivizing. Like, could it not be incentivized and required?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we can take different strategies based on some of the different affordability levels, but for the deep affordability, I think really the strategy will be to increase the market value enough so that basically to build affordable housing, the challenge is the cost of land, right? I mean, that's commonly known. So the strategy, I think, would center on increasing the market value of the property through, increases in development to offset providing land to an affordable housing provider to be able to develop those units. So with that said, I think we can get beyond the 10% in terms of the ratio as a way to do that. Again, a lot more details to work out, but that's just conceptually where we're at.
And I would add that one of the challenges that we face is that according to the commerce guidance that we're in review of, that one of the only housing typologies that is available in the toolkit to meet the deep affordability requirements is mid-rise. That you can come up with others and you can propose others, but you have to demonstrate how it will provide that level of affordability. They accept that mid-rise does provide that, but they do not accept that other housing types provide it. You have to demonstrate it and show them your work.
Okay. What do you mean by you have to demonstrate it? You actually have to build some?
You have to show how the units will achieve a sale price or a rent price within that range of affordability. So for example, townhomes. Townhomes are likely not to hit the 0 to 30% AMI. But when you're building a mid-rise development, you have more opportunity through inclusionary zoning, through partnerships, through other incentives and other requirements to get there. And that's where our challenge has been, which is why, I think the public and some of the comment we've heard has been that you're focused on compliance, you're focused on the housing allocation. And the truth is that, yes, we have been focused on that because that is the biggest change in state law. We have been working in the background on how to also provide missing middle, more diversity, different housing types. But the one you've heard the most about is the deep affordability and the housing allocation, because we want to make sure that you are fully aware that in order for us to get certification, we must do that. And that's why we've pushed it to the front. Now that we're past that, and now that you all understand that we have to do that, we're really happy to start talking about some missing middle and some other housing types and how we can promote those and add that to the comp plan as well, because that's always been part of our objective.
Okay. Just one other comment about ADUs. It seems like ADUs aren't being built, and trying to think of ways that they can be promoted. Do you think that at some point that ADUs will count to capacity?
That's, I believe, a local decision that we could make. Again, we could include it in our capacity, but we, likely wouldn't really apply it much to meeting the growth target. But yes, we could choose to do that. And again, I think perhaps going with a target would be the way to go. It gives us something to shoot for. And I think there's a lot of things I referenced earlier that we could do to help promote it, whether it's just simply a communications program. Hey, did you know that you could do this? Pre-approved plans, all sorts of things around maybe permit streamlining and things like that. So I think there's lots of opportunities there. It's a little tricky one to make estimates of in terms of production, but yeah, we can certainly fold them into the capacity and put a lot more effort into making them happen.
So that's a local decision. I didn't realize we could do that.
Yeah.
What about lot splitting? What about somebody that could sell their ADU if they were to put it on their property? Is that something we could potentially explore?
Yeah, you could condominiumize it. We've heard some feedback from other members of the community. I think there were a few planning commissioners that identified that as a bad idea for whatever reason. I think it's personal preference. If you want to do that with your property, or you want to buy one where there's a condominium that's been created, that's your choice. But that does present opportunity for us to create some smaller units that could be sold. And for the right property owner, perhaps they want to create one and sell it at a fixed at a lower 50 to 80% AMI and add a covenant to it that it can't be resold for 100 to at market.
Okay, those sound like real possibilities for capacity. Thank you.
Yep, thanks.
Councilmember Stewart.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you. This is I know this is a ton of work, and I feel like it's really coming along, so I really appreciate all the work here. I'll start with the knit, and then we'll go into the other stuff. So I have a challenge with the red-blue or the red-green color scheme. that's like a big no-no in accessibility, because if you're colorblind, you can't tell the difference between red and green. And then kind of further, always showing the affordable housing and the most deeply affordable needs in red, and then showing the community needs in green. I think there's kind of an implicit bias, right? Like red is stop or bad, and green is good and go. So just from a color scheme, but that's a nit. One question I have is, for all the numbers you showed with like where we have deficits and things like that, we don't have to make any decisions on that. That's just informative, right? So we'll get that and we can kind of
Yeah, we're
pour
working
over that
on
later.
another memo, which again, my team has put together. I need to finish my review of it, and then the staff needs to review it, and then we can put that out there. But again, we just wanted to preview it because we had it available. So no, we're not looking necessarily for any direction on that currently, but we will be bringing it back.
Because one of the things just that struck me when you were showing those things, like, I mean, it kind of seems obvious. Like, of course, we don't have a lot of people in the community who are in the 0 to 30% AMI range if we don't have any units that are affordable in 0 to 30%. I mean, how do you live somewhere if there's no housing to live in, right? So some of those numbers, like, I think it's important to have the data, but I think it's also important that when we put it out there that we kind of have some of those explanations around it so that people understand, like, well, why isn't there a deficit there? Well, because like they've never been able to move here. Like, right. So anyway, that struck me when you were showing that. I completely agree that I think we need to have more policy around requiring. So, I mean, we can call them incentives if we want to, but I think upping the affordability requirements and deepening the affordability requirements, I think, is something we're really going to have to look at. And so as we look at some of these potential land use changes, that in order to get that, and maybe that is an incentive, but if you want to take advantage of this new land use, you must not, you know, right? I mean, it's kind of the way to go. And maybe we do call those incentives because it sounds nicer.
The assumption in the centers strategy is that upzoning would be entirely contingent on providing that affordable housing. You know, in other areas, it could be optional or incentive-based, but for those affordability targets, you know, it would have to be required. Otherwise, there's no way we would get the outcomes.
And even when we're looking at some of the middle housing where we may be making some potential land use changes, can we partner with Arch to say that as part of that, again, if you want to take advantage of this, that some of those houses would be managed, or some of those units, wherever it may be, would be managed through Arch, which is what helps to keep them in that affordability range. Is that something we can put in there as well? Or other partnerships? It doesn't have to be Arch specifically.
Yeah, I think other partnerships as well is great. Arch does a lot of work for us in helping manage units that have covenants that ultimately we have to track over time. And I know that one thing that Arch has flagged is if all of the Arch cities collectively are building over the next 20 years a really large number of affordable units that they then need to track, and they have identified the number of staff that are required for X number of units, that what does their staffing model look like? So they're going through a strategic planning process now, and we're going to be asking these questions of the Arch board and of Arch staff of how can we manage these units in the long term? What other types of partnerships do we need? And what other tools do we need to ensure that as these units come online, that they're tracked and managed properly to ensure that the affordability is preserved for the life of the unit?
Yeah. I think throwing some of those clauses into our policies as well is going to be really important. Yeah. One of the things that struck me when you were showing the centers and potentially increasing density and things in centers, one of the things that struck me, I don't think it was on the slides, but it was in the documentation that we had, was when you showed the overall increases, the number of units increases in town center was only going to be like, was it 600? Or 800 units, but in the other centers, it would be 1,170 units. And I don't know if maybe the maps just aren't proportionate, but it doesn't look like those other centers, I mean, they even collectively aren't as big as town center. So can you just explain how that would kind of work out to have so much in those other centers?
Well, the existing density in the town center is greater, so it's higher on a per acre basis. And then the town center has some pipeline development that's also been subtracted.
Okay.
So that's mainly why the density in the existing centers outside the town center is only 18 units per acre. So it's quite a bit lower, and I think that's where the difference comes from.
One other thing we're going to be doing in the next few weeks is refining our modeling and some of the parameters that go into the modeling, because we want to make sure that we're understanding when we say town center. Well, town center includes multiple different zones. Some of those have commercial, some of those are residential, and our centers themselves, office versus neighborhood business versus community business, and trying to get a better understanding of exactly where each of these fits. You know, it's more of a parcel by parcel analysis. Currently, we're doing a high level overview to make sure we understand broadly, could we meet our targets? What would it look like? What are the general numbers? And if you note in the agenda bill and in the memo, there are several disclaimers in there that these are estimates that are going through further refinement. So we'll keep working on that, and the numbers, just to make sure we're all clear, likely will change, but this is a starting point for us. And as we start to turn the dials and move the levers, we can start to see where we have opportunity, and especially in following guidance from you all as to which strategies and tools you want to see us push forward.
Sure. Thank you for that. On the graphs where you showed like the size of houses and how we had under and oversupply on the housing sizes, it looked like we had a huge oversupply of 4-bedroom houses. Are there ways to, I mean, again, we don't build the houses, the, market forces, but are there ways to incentivize or restrict that to try to help balance that out? No, not this one. There
Sorry.
It was one of these. There we go.
Don't talk about phase 2 development regs.
Yeah, I mean, we did do that a bit in phase 2 in the sense that we made the house square footage proportional to the size of the lots. So if you had an existing lot that, you weren't creating a new lot, you would be sort of bound by that. And again, through some of the design analysis we did, it ensures that there's enough land to do an ADU. Could you require smaller units? You could probably do that if you wanted to. It's definitely a policy choice that we could consider for sure.
I think part of that is turning the dial on the FAR, changing the building height limits for different types of units, and maybe if you have a different affordability or missing middle design or archetype, then maybe you're able to get a higher a building height that goes up, or maybe you're allowed to have a higher FAR, and what that does is it starts to tip the scale in favor of those missing middle archetypes. I think one other thing was, I had it in my head just a second ago, I apologize. It'll come back. Just
No
give me a
worries.
sec here.
No worries. It's all good.
I'm
It's all
aging.
good. It's a lot. I would also like to see all types of development have affordable requirements, right? Wherever possible, right? Like, probably Carrie's over there probably freaking out, but like wherever we legally possible can throw those things in, I would like to see that. I don't think it should just be like in the centers. I appreciate that the centers are incredible opportunities because of walkability and transit and things like that. But I think we have to really, given the numbers, we have to kind of turn all those dials. And then I had one more, now I can't remember it either. But I will cede until I remember.
Councilmember Napure.
Thank you, Mayor. Jeff, thank you for all the graphics and the presentation. I think my favorite one is the one where you had the needs assessment and then also, what is required and what policies we can have. So that chart probably was my most favorite, with those little icons at the bottom which show different kinds of housing. I think that that was a cherry on top. So thank you for doing that.
No problem. I got to give credit to my team. I did not, personally put that together, but they're amazing, and they did a really good job on
Yeah,
this.
I think, please, especially for that draft, please convey our thanks to the staff.
Will do.
It was very easy to just understand, right? Like what you were trying to say through that picture. So I just have a few sort of questions so that I can understand this better. I know we just talked about ADUs, and given the makeup of what is Sammamish, has it been your understanding that ADUs are really hard to build when you have HOAs, for example? Has that been, because that is what Sammamish has had very few, as you can show it in your data, 6 or 7 ADUs permits requested?
Yeah.
And so, just curious about, is there a relationship between having a HOA and ADUs, and what is your observation from other cities?
Yeah, I suppose there could. I have not actually heard that as a big issue in working in other cities, so that'd be something that we would want to look into further and see if that's a restriction. If anyone here is aware of that, be great to hear any anecdotes, but I have not heard that as a specific limitation, doing this work in other communities, so we'll take a look at it.
Yeah, because
Good
I
point.
definitely think it's pretty restrictive, like the
Yeah.
HOA regulations, right? I mean, you can't even change the paint of your house.
Yeah,
I think for detached specifically, I would agree. I would really be curious about attached ADUs. I know there was one project recently that we had where this homeowner came in and actually brought in a conveyor belt and dug out his basement and extended his house down a whole floor and created an illegal ADU downstairs. And it was within an HOA neighborhood. So he didn't actually change the appearance of the home. He just simply pushed the foundation down and created a downstairs living unit in a rental.
Interesting. But yeah, I would be, because I think especially if we want to continue to pursue ADUs as a policy choice, we need to understand these other limitations as well.
Yeah, totally agree.
And then when you were referring to planned residential developments, were you talking about things like Lahani or Trazax? Is that what we were talking about?
Yeah, those are examples. They're larger planned communities, and they may deviate somewhat from the standard set of development rules, but with the premise that there's going to be more public benefits and a better outcome, however that's defined. So it gives a little bit more flexibility, potentially maybe even more development in some cases, but maybe it's got affordable housing, or it's built a park, or it's made some street connections, or however we want to define what those public benefits are. But yeah, those are good examples.
There is a project example that comes to my mind. It was called, this is in Bellevue, it's called the Enclave at Fox Glen, and the name, but it's right across from Crossroads, and it's a transition area, so it's right adjacent to a commercial core, and it was some single-family homes that were dated and were removed, and what they did was they came in and built, I think, 6 duplex units, and all the duplexes met all of the current green building standards. It was built by a gentleman named Robert Pantley, who does really amazing building. And they're all energy efficient units, and they were able to get some increases in density, and they did have an affordable concomitant attached to that, and they did build 2 affordable units in that development. So I think that's a really good example of missing middle, planned unit development or planned residential development that had great landscaping, common areas, and allowed for some additional density to go in there.
So planned residential development doesn't have to be like huge like Lahani. It can be even smaller, but
Yeah, we were thinking a minimum of 5 acres, just so it's a scale, but it can, 5 acres is significantly smaller, as you know, than Klahani. So yeah, it can be scaled to be smaller, and I think that's probably more reflective of what we would see given, the city's, built out in a lot of ways.
what is that development right across from like Safeway and Trader Joe's? Is that kind of like a planned residential development?
Yeah, it kind of has that feel. The Laurels is another one that comes to mind.
I mean, Laurel's is, but this is actually more like, I think they have, I think it's townhomes or condos.
It's more of a missing middle type.
Right.
Yeah, that's
Right,
actually right
exactly.
across from the commercial there, and it's it's really well done. And I think it depends who you are. Some people might like it, don't like it. really depends.
Right.
But yeah, that's another
That
example.
is-
And I agree with Jeff that a planned residential development is better achieved at scale. So something of 5 acres, but it could, if you wanted us to pursue that, be smaller. It tends to be more complex because we're looking at some form of administrative design review as part of a planned residential development, and it's not really cost effective for a developer to go through that type of process with fewer number of units.
Yeah, and I think this explanation was really helpful for me because from my perspective, I just knew about like the bigger planned, developments than like the smaller, a little bit more contained. So that's really good to know. So I think in the slide which shows the the middle overlay housing, I think missing housing overlay, I think it shows some housing, like I think Mary Victor pointed out to it, like in Sahali, right? Like where the golf club is. Is that what it's showing here? Or like the blues?
It may be, but again, these maps are just showing proximity to these certain services. It's not necessarily saying that a parcel wouldn't otherwise have some limitations on it. And when we do the zoning, we could also write exceptions to that for certain things. So I think there's some fine tuning to address that issue. This is largely a mapping exercise at this point.
Okay.
This is part of what I was also referencing, where we're going to need to start to clean this up and go through some of the finer parameters. This is our first start at this, and just wanting to show you and get feedback as we progress to make sure we're on track, because we don't want to spend a lot of time modeling things that ultimately you're not interested in pursuing.
Right. Yeah. So I know this also shows the adjacent centers to be studied. So thank you, David, for adding that, because I know we had an offline conversation on that. Are we also exploring some adjacent sort of centers which are to the south of the city? I mean, basically you have Highlands, which is, I don't know how, if it's, what radius are we considering for these approximate centers to be studied? Like, is it, it just says half a mile? Okay.
Yeah, those are just from the existing ones. And again, if down the road, there was just a new center that was designated, then this map would be updated. And, if there's a new street connection, it'll be updated. There's a new school or parks, it becomes this dynamic system that the city will have to manage, which is reasonable. But yeah, that's how it would work. And I think, at this point, we haven't identified any specific locations for other centers. So we're just kind of focused on the existing ones.
So I know we talked, in your presentation, you had a lot of information about cottage houses. Have you worked with communities where they have more of like a community house where?
Yep.
And then
Yeah, a really good project up in Langley that I was, well, I guess I'll reference 2 projects in Langley. One was by a local architect named Ross Chapin, and he was an early designer that did some cottage housing projects. He's also a friend of mine and wrote a book called Pocket Neighborhoods, which is a lot about cottage housing and small-scale neighborhood housing. And he brought this older kind of what you would typically think of a condo, in the 80s or whatever, and turned it into this project called the Fifth Street Commons. He built like a common building. He worked with some other kind of local community investors. They renovated all the units and then sold them at remarkably affordable prices. And so it's an affordable kind of co-housing project that's been really successful right near downtown Langley and within the walkable area. Another project I was more heavily involved in on permitting was called Upper Langley. It was an affordable housing project done through a demonstration program of some longtime community members, purchased land, extended some of the infrastructure that was needed. They got a lot of flexibility in some of the development standards, and then we're selling the lots basically at cost to community members to develop a co-housing project. So those are 2 cool ones. There's a number of also great cottage housing examples, although admittedly some of them are not always super affordable, particularly if they're done by a really well-known architect like Ross. So there's some, I think, that are more affordable than others. But yeah, I have, happy to provide lots of examples of all of that. And they are typically really successful because they have really nice common shared open space. So, people that maybe are living alone or whatnot really, I think, like that. And it's got a really nice sense of community. There could be community gardens, walkable locations and things like that.
Great. And, to that, again, chart where we saw there is a surplus or a large number of 4-bedroom homes, for example.
Yep.
So what happens if, they rent out 2 bedrooms in their house and at affordable prices? Does that count towards?
Yeah, I mean, theoretically, that would be reflected in the household data, but it probably isn't. But yeah, that would be potentially a gap. And I think there was some interesting study I saw years ago of someone who quantified like how many extra bedrooms there were in a city. And it's like, it's astounding, right? When you think about it, So yeah, for what it's worth, that may not be reflected in the data, and someone could certainly do that. They would be considered one household if they were, sharing the unit.
Yeah, I'm curious how the whole Airbnb has influenced and impacted that as well.
Yeah, I'll give that some thought and see if there's any insights we have from any of the data on that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Councilmember Trine?
Yeah, so first, on the feasible housing types by income band, the GMA mandate is 2,100 homes. So that is a mandate for planning. It's not a mandate to build them.
Not a mandate to build them.
Thank
but
you.
At the same time, we do have some monitoring and reporting that we need to do that's going to track whether that's happened or not. And
in the first 5 years, they're going to mandate. Yeah, they're going to do
so
that.
I think we're accountable for planning and attempting to implement it. We're not accountable for having to build it.
Yeah, so our growth target was 2,100, meaning the city of Sammamish is going to build 2,100 affordable housings to meet their growth target over the next 20 years, and that's completely impossible to do. So I know that's some harsh reality right there, but the reality is thus. So we know that we're going to be building homes that are at market value because, well, that's what the market does. They build at market value. So I just want to be clear on the fact that the GMA mandate is a mandate for planning, and that is what it means. Second, you asked the questions here. I'll just scroll down here to the questions. Do you suggest changes or additions to the land use principles? For the most part, I don't. I know that because I like what you did, because you even said this, there are going to be conflicts or competing interests that are going to compete against each other. And so I'm not afraid of those as a council member to say we have to address several issues, and we will have to do that throughout the comp plan update, not just on this particular topic. So as far as the principle goes, that part I think you're doing a good job. Keep moving forward with that. If they want to do some fine tuning, or if you guys do, then that's fine too. As far as do I have input whether the state or the regional planning requirements are consistent or inconsistent with certain local needs such as housing, infrastructure, economic development, climate impacts, transportation, and other factors. Wow. Okay, tough one there because that's a complex puzzle you just threw at me, and I'm supposed to put all these pieces together and give you an answer for that. So let me just put it this way, as simple as I can. I think the economic development plan is not required right now by the GMA for the city of Sammamish. So as far as the economic development plan or economic development piece of it is, you could probably spend very little time on that going forward. As far as the climate impact, I don't even know if I really want to address that, except I would address it in this way in regards to housing, is that I like the idea for the, if you go, well, I'll go backwards since I'm ADUs, fantastic. Figure out how to incentivize or make it so that the permits are inexpensive or you can fast track it, then I'm all for ADUs because the land is already there. When it comes to the large lot cottage housing, especially when you look at the map that you've drawn out there, the places that that could be done and the numbers that can be created from that, and the need that is being requested by some residents to be able to downsize, I think large lot cottage housing is a good way to go, mainly because it also would be a way to preserve our trees, which would have an impact, a positive impact on the environment and climate change. So large lot cottage housing, nice. And then the last I would just say, hey, if we're going to increase capacity in the centers, then okay, let's increase the capacity in the centers that currently have asphalt, concrete, steel, glass, and metal. Because again, it's about how can I provide the housing necessary to meet the mandate so that I have the least amount of impact on the environment, which in turn, in my way of thinking about it, is that then I'm actually working to offset the climate change that's going to take place, especially those CO2 emissions. Which leads me to the question then, with those three to start with, would those meet the 2,100 growth target? Just using those three.
Potentially, I think the bonus parcels is the other one that, you know, warrants some further consideration. It makes the challenge that much harder if we take that out of the equation, but it, you know, something we could certainly try to quantify and come back to you. But it just reduces the land area, and it's land that is potentially available without not a lot of other potential uses. So there is that factor, but not to say that it would be impossible, but it makes it more challenging.
Right, which is
Yeah.
a real complex, challenging problem to start with. So
For sure.
I'm really impressed, by the way, with the work that you're doing and the information. So I wouldn't be totally against the bonus parcels myself either.
Yeah.
And something to keep on the table to continue to look at.
Yeah, we'd also like to do some outreach too, you know, I mean, talk to some of the property owners and, you know, so there's some further work in terms of dialogue to figure out how we can match up the analysis with kind of what's happening on the ground with some of these organizations. So we plan to do that, and we'll make sure we communicate that back.
And my last comment, and not to, I don't want to sound negative here, but the one that concerns me the most for the unintended consequences that it would be over the next 20 years is that middle housing overlay zone, the way you have it laid out currently in the presentation, would be, I would say, off the table for me. I'm not saying that I'm against middle housing. What I'm saying is when I look at this plan, if this was the plan, I just see it looks like it's actually dividing the city and then fragmenting it to such a level that we could never, ever have wildlife corridors. So I would totally be against that then for that reason. Thank you very much, and back to you, Mayor.
Appreciate it.
Councilmember O'Farrell.
Great, thank you. I just had I had a quick question about on the presentation there, when we talked about creating housing on property owned by, say, churches, mosques, temples, those kinds types of communities. And I'd wondered, had any of our, for example, our, say, churches, just for the Christian faith, have they expressed any interest in doing such a thing? They tend to have large lots. I know my own church, Mary Queen of Peace, massive parking lot. I just wondered, had they expressed going forward with kind of things changing in that area of everybody's lives, with maybe congregations down and maybe they don't need the space that they used to anymore? Are they interested in developing their properties further?
So the most recent one we've heard from was prior to COVID, and it's right across the street. I don't know the name of the congregation or the church where the park and ride is across from the high school. And they have some space in the back there that they were looking at building some housing that they could use as transitional housing or support housing. as part of their mission, and they felt that they needed a. They were revisiting their mission, and they were revisiting, who they were, how to reach out better into the community and engage the community, and that was one of the methods that they were considering at that time. I haven't heard from them since then. Don't know what the status of that is, but that's an example of conversation. I know that Jeff had some other examples. I think in Bellevue there was one that was an example, and we're definitely, as we're going to refine mapping and as we're continuing to work on this, going to be doing outreach to the Regency centers, to the property owners, and start to talk to them. It was premature to talk to them prior to coming to you and trying to get direction on what we should be looking at.
Yeah.
So now, now that we're moving forward on some of these, at least we feel that we're hearing not necessarily direction, because we're hearing positive feedback that helps us refine down which tools to focus on, and we'll start to talk to property owners now that we have this information.
Great, yeah, I just wonder, especially with the Catholic Church, that they have, they're involved a lot in community housing, and so I think that might be something to pursue. And I'm not sure how congregations are since we've emerging out of COVID, and I think congregations may be quite down, and maybe they don't need the space, the parking spaces that they used, and maybe there is opportunity there to maybe make that property work more for the organization or for community. So I think that's probably is something worth pursuing. That sounds great. Again, about the ADUs, I really support that. I think that's a great strategy. And maybe, would you say the biggest, our single biggest boundary to our barrier to creating more ADUs in the city is lot size? That's kind of is that what we're running into? That's why it hasn't been taken up as much as maybe other jurisdictions?
It's really hard to say. I think a lot of communities, as I referenced earlier, struggle with ADU production. I definitely think that's a factor, particularly around newer developments. But with that said, there are significantly larger lots and spots of the city where it still hasn't been developed. So it's kind of difficult to say exactly what the driver is, but maybe David is.
Yeah, my observation would be, in addition to what Jeff's saying, is that it has to do with the fact that the homes are large already, and you don't necessarily need an ADU for additional space. And further, the incomes are high, and you don't necessarily need additional income. So with those two factors, there aren't many people looking to build an ADU.
Right.
But one thing we could do is make it easy and help facilitate that. And maybe there are others that would be interested in starting to add that to their portfolio of property, or however they consider it.
And my observation too is that in more urban areas where the land values are much higher, you're starting to see more production. I mean, there's a lot. My, again, somewhat casual observation is, like in Seattle, you're seeing a lot more of that, again, because the housing need is great and the land costs are high and the housing costs are high. That dynamic may not be the same here.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe in some larger lot, especially the houses that are maybe 4 or 5 bedroom houses or 4 bedroom, and they maybe do not have a basement, where it's easy to kind of section off, where you might have aging parents who want to move into the ADU and give the bigger house to their children and their grandchildren and do it kind of that way, but they're all staying in the same area, but they're not in each other's spaces. So I just wonder, going forward, if we'll see more of that might be an alternative to people aging in place. And if we had, maybe we'll see more pickup of that. But in terms of the permitting, the paperwork, all that kind of thing for ADUs, do we feel like that's kind of a very simple process in Sammamish, and it's easy for a property owner to walk through that? Are there any kind of barriers we could remove or make it simpler, easier for people to go through that process?
So it depends what the property is, right? It's geometry, it's geography, it's constraints. But there are definitely things that we could do to facilitate that. I think Jeff hit on some prior that were, pre-approved plans that someone could purchase for $300 or some reasonable price, or we could even give them away if we wanted to. Then that when you have that, and when your property meets certain parameters, certain size, certain geometry, limitations on restrictions, not in a wetland or a stream or a steep slope, that we could really expedite the permitting on that. I think one of the big ones, though, is always going to be impervious surface.
Yeah.
And that one, until we have a solution to fix where the stormwater goes, will always be a big barrier. And it really depends geographically where you're building in that case and where your water's flowing.
All right, that's a really good point. Thank you for that. That's something that I had not thought about. Thank you for that. I like the cottage housing. I like the anything to do with middle housing and trying to solve that conundrum. And I know that that's a big one for us here in Sammamish. Thank you for taking on board Mary's suggestion about the critical area overlay and paying attention to maps. Appreciate that. And I think that'll be useful for all of us going forward, the more information we have. And I think that's everything I had. Thank you.
So Councilmember Stewart, I see you. I'm going to go first, that's right. So I wouldn't take anything off yet. I think it's, I can't imagine eliminating anything without completely understanding the full picture. As far as middle housing and workforce housing, because I just hear those sometimes interchangeably, it's very confusing. So for middle housing, first question, how long would that covenant run? So somebody doesn't buy it, turn around and sell it for, double the price. And then workforce housing, are there any restrictions there as well? Like, I swear I read something where someone was trying to sell their workforce house, but they couldn't find a teacher or somebody to sell it to. So it kind of restricted their ability to sell.
Yeah, that's a good question. So middle housing typically refers to just a housing typology, right? So it's a townhouse. And then workforce housing could be middle housing, it could be something else, but again, it's generally housing for the workforce within your community, and there's some overlap on that. Middle housing could have covenants and income restrictions, or it could not. It kind of depends on the scale of project, but again, larger projects, you're doing 10 townhomes, in an area where it's single family zoning now based on the overlay. Now you're getting at a point where maybe one or two of the units could be affordable, have a covenant, and be restricted. It's usually done through a deed restrictions recorded in King County, sets the affordability timeline, and then what the resale restrictions are for that. And that could happen with any type of housing unit per se.
Yeah, that was mostly my thing, is just making sure it runs long enough so it's not like
typically 99 years or so.
Cool.
Yeah.
Perfect. Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, we could always do, 30 years after the last dependent of King Charles III dies or something. I've heard that's been, sorry. Anyway, one question, when I was looking stuff up, can you define mid-rise? I saw a bunch of different definitions for mid-rise housing, and I was wondering when we talked about
It's typically around 4 to, it's typically 4 to 6, but I would say that's stretching to 7 to 8 with some of the newer timber mass. There's an 8-story mass timber building being built in Seattle right next to our office. Kind of blocked my view of Mount Rainier, but that's okay. Which is pretty cool to see. So I would say it's 4 to 8 being generous, and then typically, high-rise construction, different constructions type, totally different deal, would not likely be economically feasible in Sammamish. You start to get 10 stories and above.
It's also not as environmentally friendly sometimes. So, as we look to achieve multiple goals at the same time. So I like that. One of the items when you talk about the different demographics that we're trying to solve for, one of the demographics I didn't see on there were some of our young adults. When we had coffee with council this weekend, we had some of our young adults in the community who really want to stay, but kind of can't. So I was hoping we could add that in our bulleted list of we talk about people who want to downsize. Can we add our young adults? Because, if you grow up here and you want to stay, we should hopefully try to accommodate that.
Yeah, totally. Actually, we were having a discussion about that in the office today, because we were saying, well, trying to talk about, strategize what are the different ways that you could quantify local needs, and that was something we talked about. So I don't necessarily have a strategy to address that yet, but
it should be at least listed there as one of the groups that we want to
I think it should be listed, and I think there's some additional work to kind of maybe it's just scenarios, or we all kind of understand it with maybe our own kids and what they might be facing, but just what would it mean? What would you have to do to stay in Sammamish, assuming you didn't, have other means beyond, your job or whatnot, what would that look like? And I think we can take a look at that for sure.
Cool. Another thing that came up when you talk about sort of these other sort of local centers was the idea of a neighborhood store or bodegas.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know how we define center. Maybe we can define center to be something very small, but that was something that everybody was super excited about. It creates, again, the walkability that you can, get some of your needs met really right there and create some other opportunities. So that was something that people really got excited about.
Yeah, I could see different classifications of centers. I mean, the existing centers we have are kind of larger scale, but there could be some small ones that are, essentially a small area around an intersection or whatnot to be able to provide those. So that's, they can be tough to see happen economically, but certainly something that we can plan for.
Just something to think about, I think. As we talk about incentivizing affordability, do we also have to talk about restricting short-term rentals so that, again, we don't end up with somebody building an ADU and then it just becomes a short-term rental income for them and it's not really helping us with the housing challenges?
Yes, I think we should talk about that. I don't have a sense of how big the Airbnb market is in Sammamish, but maybe some of you do, and that would be easy for us to take a look at. And I think the approach that a lot of cities have taken, which I think is a pretty reasonable one, is allowing folks to do Airbnb if it's still their primary residence, like it's sort of additive or whatnot, but it's not actually taking away a housing unit. Maybe there's a way to game the system on that, but that's the approach I think that Boise took.
I kind of like the ideas
and
of that.
And a few others, so it's like, you can do it, but not to take away housing from the community. So that's certainly something we'd be happy to look into.
Excellent. And then in terms of like economic development, I kind of feel like we, the city, need it, right? I mean, when you just kind of pencil out the math of inflation is severely outpacing our ability to increase property tax revenues. So I do think we kind of do have to look at that as part of all of these strategies, is making sure we're looking at an economic development plan so we can maintain the levels of service that our communities come to expect. So I think that's important. And then directionally, I would agree with the mayor, right? I don't think we should take anything off the table yet. What I would kind of add to that would be that we need to consider everything, but we should prioritize those things that are really going to yield the most and the most deeply affordable units, right? And I think it is worth looking at some of the PSRC studies that have come out. Love the idea of middle housing, but some of these programs, they've done some research and have determined that even if we provide these capabilities for people to do certain things, they're probably not going to happen. Whereas I think when you look at like the centers, whether, it's the most exciting thing or not, those units are probably going to get built. But, some of those other strategies may not yield as much. So I don't know if you saw that one, but the PSRC, I think we talked about that last time, was that they came out with, hey, if these bills were to pass and people were to do these things, here's how much housing would actually end up getting built.
We've been a part of some local studies of that. And one of the projects had a market study that was a component of it. And I think of the feasible lots, typically what we've seen, and we've had these conversations with some of our other colleagues that have done this work around the country, it's like 5 to 10, maybe 15% of feasible lots over a 20-year period.
Right.
So in terms of like expressing degree of community change, it can be relatively modest. But again, if you limit the area where that can happen and you're dealing with those small percentages, then your production is, probably going to be fairly low.
Right. So that's why I think from a prioritization standpoint, as you guys go through and look at this, because, doing all of the policies and all the work to make them all happen, if some of them are going to yield very tiny numbers, they may not be the strategies we want to tackle first.
And I think that is consistent with one of the guiding principles around existing impervious, is that in order to keep the cost down, because one of the biggest costs to development is dealing with stormwater. And if you're able to take existing impervious, apply the new stormwater rules, improve it, because currently there is not the retention, detention, water quality that is needed, and have them build that to whatever upgrade is needed. It's still a lesser amount than a greenfield development where you're putting in the stormwater. So those are also more likely to build out because the cost is lower, because the stormwater cost is lower.
Then like looking at like middle housing overlays, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah, but I mean, in terms of the centers, I think all the centers are probably going to yield a lot more affordability. And we haven't even talked about the emergency housing, which is probably going to have to be in and around the centers as well, so. Thanks. Is that all you needed from a directional standpoint, is kind of, I don't think we're taking anything off the table yet.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that sounds good to us. I think there was potential minor change to the land use principles that was considered in the beginning. But beyond that, I feel like we've gotten pretty clear direction.
Yeah, so do you want a vote on that? Because I think Deputy Mayor Lamb and Councilmember Howe had a thought on that, and then this goes to Planning Commission on Thursday, and then comes back to us May 16th. So do you want something on that land use principle voted on now?
I think the land use principles are more of an informal thing that we're using going forward, but we want to make sure that we have that clear direction, so that we're not, one council member doesn't think it says something and another thinks it says something else, and we end up trying to hit something that's not the target that you all think it is. So really, if we could just clarify, and it's really an informal, I don't know that we can vote on something or give direction on something as it is a regular business meeting tonight. Sorry, I was trying to figure out what type of meeting is it.
Yeah.
So if we could do that, we would really appreciate it, and then we'll carry that forward to the Planning Commission as the new revised version and work with it going forward.
Cool. So,
Amy, you just wanted to take out the word change, is that right?
I wanted to take out the last three words to change. I can't remember what it says.
I know, I don't have
just to change it to adapt as needed, that it needed to adapt, like the zoning.
So it would read, be complementary to existing historic land use and zoning patterns so that the fundamental development pattern and general distribution of urban intensity of the change adapt to change. Intensity of the city adapt to change.
Yeah.
so moved. I'm just, yeah. Is that what do you want to make that motion?
Okay, second.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought somebody has to actually make it.
I thought you were making the motion.
I don't know if I can make it after what you said. Okay, great. Okay. So you are my second.
Yes.
Okay. Any discussion on that? All right. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
All right. What you said, David? Does that work?
That was what Councilmember Lamb, Deputy Mayor Lamb had previously said.
Yes.
So that was just tracking
But you read
that.
it out loud, so it was helpful because like seeing it is not, I can't see it visually. So we're good to go? Cool. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you for working through the volumes of material here. I know it's a lot, and we're really trying to keep this moving and appreciate your focus on this.
Cool. I'm anticipating a break because this is going longer than I thought. I'm thinking resume at 9, unless you guys can be back in 5 minutes, which never happens. 9, and then I think we're getting, Mark will be coming on. Does that work? Okay. All right. Correct. We'll be back in 11 minutes. All right, welcome back. So Mark, I will hand it over to you for adopting an updated purchasing manual.
All right, good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council members. Mark Baird, Administrative Services Director. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
How about now?
Yes.
Excellent. I'm here this evening to talk about the update to the city's purchasing manual and the proposed resolution that would adopt this updated manual. I'll touch on the importance of the contracting process for the city, highlight how the current purchasing manual came about, summarize the process for updating the manual, provide some examples of the updates made to the purchasing manual, talk about how council member input was incorporated into this manual, and identify the requested council action. So the city of Sammamish relies heavily on contracts with many entities to get the work done and provide services to the community. And this ranges from large public works projects all the way to a basic professional services contract for a small specific task. It involves processes that are governed by state and federal requirements, guidelines, and laws. And as such, there's a need for the city's purchasing policies and procedures to comply with all of those applicable requirements. The current manual dates back to 2008, where it was adopted by council through resolution. And since that time, there's been no real significant updates to the manual. At the same time, municipal purchasing requirements and practices have evolved and changed, as have state and federal requirements and procedures around them. And the city's purchasing policies and procedures require updating and changes in order to meet those changes. And you may recall that updating the purchasing manual was part of the 2023 council work plan. Work really began on beginning to update the manual going back to 2022. A former contracts administrator began the work, which really ended up leading to a complete rewrite or sort of a restyling of the manual. And over the rest of this time, a lot of work has been done by many entities, by legal, the grants and contracts unit, and members of the city manager's office. There have been a number of significant changes and adds. We've added women and minority-owned business language in the bidding process, strengthened conflict of interest language and guidelines, updated references in applicable state and federal laws on procurement and purchases. And this includes updates to links and references to these laws as they've changed over time, and updates to the professional services requirements and the various threshold amounts for each. There have been additions to the Title VI provisions, additional federal award standards. There are updates to the city manager signing limits to coincide with the municipal code, clarifications on staff roles within the procurement process, and then a whole host of other housekeeping style and language updates as well. As a result of this being on the agenda this evening, we received some council member input, which resulted in our being able to make some additions to the manual in order to improve it as well. There's an added reference to the employee handbook conflict of interest section. We've added clarifying language to section 5.9 on change orders and defining thresholds to make it more clear. Reworked definitions in section 17.4 and 17.8 related to change orders or contract modifications. Added a new section, section 6.5, related to extending architectural and engineering contracts. So this evening, we'd like you to consider adopting the resolution that would repeal the resolution in the existing manual and adopt the new purchasing manual. And I would take any questions.
Councilmember Howe?
Thank you. I think this is a quick question. I don't think that it's the purpose of the manual to capture this data, but is there a, like for the women and minority owned businesses or BIPOC businesses, where would we capture how often we're able to meet those objectives?
And this is where a project like this really ties into our other DEIB efforts.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to make sure we were capturing it. Thank you. I didn't think it'd be in the manual. I wasn't sure.
one of the things that we need to do is get a good handle on the base of the approximate, 100 or so contracts that we have, how many of those are held by women and minority-owned businesses. And then a next step of that would be, what kind of a goal do we want to set in terms of whether it's a percentage or a number for those as well.
Just a quick follow-on. Are subcontractors also held by the same DEIB?
There is, I would need to go back and check on that. I think it's primarily focused on the main contractor.
That's
in terms of whether there's some language there.
okay. Thank you.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah. Hey, Mark, thanks for all your work on this. In regards to the addition of section 6.5, super happy to see that. I guess one question I have on that is where it says that the city staff should regularly evaluate all proposed extensions of contracts to determine whether it is in the city's best interest to simply extend the contract or issue an RFQ or solicit quotes. What would be the criteria to determine if it's in the city's best interest? If we don't, again, it feels like for RFPs, right, where there are monetary, limits when we know we have to go out for RFP, the RFQ process just seems so loosey-goosey. I mean, theoretically, you could select someone and have them for 20 years and never go out for another RFQ, and that feels somewhat inadequate.
Yeah, there are some times with some of the type of work that's done where we're going out and switching out, for instance, a consultant or a vendor, kind of starting over at ground zero with some work may end up being more costly and more time prohibitive than continuing on.
Yep.
And that's where we want to maintain flexibility, but we do want to require that analysis is done to make sure that we're making the best choice for the city between balancing those costs in time and money and going out for bid to ensure that we get what we need.
Yeah, I appreciate that. It's just that isn't written in here. And so that's what I was wondering is if we should put in, like, how is that evaluation done? And should there still be like some sort of a time limit? Like if we haven't gone out for RFQ after 5 years, or should we, do a new RFQ at a minimum every 5 years, if not, more frequently or something like that, just to ensure that we're not staying with it just because it is easier for sure. I mean, I have that situation at my work as well, but that doesn't mean it's always the best thing. And so we have time limits and we have to reevaluate periodically.
Yeah, one of the mechanisms we do have now with having the grants and contracts unit is it's another layer and group to be able to help with that evaluation. It's not just the particular department or the unit that needs the work done.
So,
thank you, Mayor. If I may, Councilmember Stewart, I appreciate where you're going with this. I think where I would like, and I think the manual itself is trying to give us parameters and direction and clear, understanding about how things work. I think ultimately what you are describing is in part a judgment call, and I think that's where we're trying to maintain some flexibility to be able to make that call in the moment. And I recognize that there might be times where, we might come to council like we had a week or so ago, where we reach one of those moments where we say, we need to reevaluate that. But I think in terms of putting a specific time frame or a recurrence, I agree with you that we would never hold a contract for 20 years. And I know
was obviously an extreme case.
You were just using a little bit of hyperbole, and I appreciate that. But I also know that we are evaluating these very regularly, and the contract that we were discussing in the last meeting was also one which we were trying to hold through the biennium, and then we would reevaluate. So I think there are some built-in measures where we would, again, reevaluate. And like Mark was saying, the grants and contracts unit is separate from most of the actual contracts being held by different departments, and they would be that secondary review to say, we think it's time. So.
Okay, I still think it just, I mean, we had a situation where we quadrupled a size of a contract for an RFQ that only had one respondent 3 years ago. That feels like we didn't go through a very rigorous, what is in the city's best interest criteria. And maybe we did, we just don't know what that was, so, thanks.
Councilmember Trine?
Mayor, thank you. Is there any more council members who have questions?
I did just have one comment before you make that motion. Under 12.3, I'm so sorry I didn't write this. MSDS is just SDS now. Just drop the material and the M. Please, continue.
Thank you, Mayor. I move that the City Council hereby repeals the existing purchasing manual adopted pursuant to Resolution number 2008-325, and that the City Council hereby adopts the updated purchasing manual set forth in Attachment 1, which is incorporated and adopted by reference for the use in soliciting vendors, procuring contracts, and making purchases for the city, and that this resolution should become effective immediately upon adoption. Thank you.
Second. Any discussion? Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, I'd like to propose an amendment that we add to section 6.5 that the evaluation that's done be submitted to the council with the with any extensions that are requested. So it gives you that flexibility, but that way we have that information when we're making the decision.
Second. I think Councilmember Howe also has a question. Is it on this?
I have a different question, so I'm not going to speak to yours.
Okay. Deputy Mayor Lamb?
Oh, I wanted to ask Councilmember Stewart, would you want this to apply only for certain dollar amounts, contracts with certain dollar amounts?
No, because with the RFQs, there's no dollar criteria. So it's just, if we're going to do the evaluation for the city's best interest, I think that's great, and I think you having that flexibility is important, but if that's submitted, if that's a requirement as part of the agenda bill for any extension, then we'll have that information.
All right. All those in favor of that amendment say aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Nay. All right, 5-2. Councilmember Howe?
My amendment is I would like to see that that contractors and subcontractors have a active DEIB program.
Second that.
All right. Would you like to talk to that?
I could speak very briefly to that, just that it's important that we carry through with the DEIB work, and that subs are held accountable as well, that they need to have a DEIB statement on their website, that they need to have a DEIB program as well. It's city money we're paying, so.
All right. Any other discussion on that? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
So, Mark, I'm assuming you're scribbling frantically.
Yes.
So now can I still vote on this resolution, though? Scott, go ahead.
Mayor, I think
Yeah.
Carrie and I might like to just, I know you all just voted, but I think, and I appreciate, I know where the intent is, but I just think we want to offer just a slight note of caution here.
Sorry I wasn't faster on my button to speak. But on that last motion that was just approved regarding a DEIB component for contractors and subs, I wasn't clear, and I think it really is important to clarify now if that's a requirement or just something that would be awarded additional points when scoring for determining who to award to. Because as a requirement, my concern is that it could potentially really limit the city's choices going forward. Just a comment, and then if council, and again, I apologize, I wasn't quicker to press my button, but if council could clarify that, that would be appreciated.
From my point of view, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with limiting our choices to those entities that actually have those types of programs.
Deputy Mayor Lamb?
I think giving a potential contractor additional points, I mean, I would be fine with that.
Yeah, and more of the points than the absolute. Councilmember DePure?
Yeah, I also want us to be very cautious in requiring, and here I mean, my question is, typically for an organization maybe, or a contractor, subcontractor who itself is maybe minority owned, do they also then explicitly have to say that they are DEIB compliant, or they have policies for that? I mean, I think it just sort of, it can, we can dig ourselves into a hole, I think. So I would like us to, I would actually honestly like more data. Of course, we want to encourage our contractors and subcontractors to be DEIB compliant. We want them to be sustainable, follow best practices. But I'm just not sure if it's going to be practical. So I would like us to use this tool to educate our contractors and subcontractors and vendors if need be, but I don't know if we will benefit from having it as an absolute.
Councilmember Howe, I do see your, I just don't know what we have to do if we need to.
Another amendment, right?
So under Robert's Rules of Order, to have a motion to reconsider, someone who voted in the majority needs to make a motion to reconsider so that you can essentially try to have a do-over.
Councilmember Howe?
I believe you'll find that the city of Seattle actually has this requirement as part of their contracting rules. Now, granted, they're a larger entity and able to have a bigger bucket of cash to wield, certainly. I don't think this has to be an onerous thing. I think it is having a stated DEIB policy on their website would be very straightforward and very achievable for virtually any entity that has a website.
But that would add another, if you have a website, you have to have, Deputy Mayor Lamb?
I think Councilmember Indeprairie brought up a good point when she brings up sustainability, because it's not just DEIB. We want to make sure that potential contractors also have, they're using green equipment and all of that. So I think this opens up a lot of issues right now, and I don't even think that maybe this is the best time to vote on something like this.
So, yes.
Another procedural option, because I'm quickly reviewing Robert's Rules of Order, is amend something previously adopted. So someone could move to amend to have the prior requirement be instead a factor that could be awarded points as a criterion, as opposed to a requirement, if that's a motion that someone would like to make.
I would like to make that motion.
So you move to amend something previously adopted?
Yes, but do I need to move to amend Councilmember Howe's previously adopted amendment?
Yes.
To say, I'm just saying it now out loud so we can capture it, to say consideration will be given for points, but I don't know how many points that would mean either. So I think that's another.
I just think that to make it clear that it's not going to be a requirement, but it's going to be something that will be considered in an award of any contract.
Okay, so instead of a requirement, it will be considered in awarding a contract. That was my motion.
Second.
So if no,
Can you
okay.
say that again? Sorry.
God, seriously.
Well,
okay.
okay. You don't have to.
Move to
amend something previously adopted.
Something previously adopted, which was Councilmember Howe's amendment, instead to say it is not a requirement that you have DEIB on your website or as part of your ethos, that it will be a consideration in awarding points for the contract.
Second.
Whew.
Thank you, Mayor.
Yeah. Do you have a question on that?
No,
It's just a mouthful. All right. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Who's the nays? Raise your hand. 1, 2, 3. Okay, 4, 3. Okay, so we're good with that, Carrie?
With that amendment.
Thanks. And now for this resolution 2023-1003, we have not voted on it yet.
That's correct.
But this is still okay as is? As amended.
As amended.
Okay, perfect. Who seconded yours, Kent, or Councilmember Treen? I think we had a second somewhere. Okay. All right. What was that? Okay. All those in favor of adopting this manual as amended into Resolution 2023-1003, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right. Thanks, Mark. Sorry.
No problem. Thank you.
I don't know if I just learned anything, but I just got more confused, but I think I learned something there. So thank you, Carrie, for catching us there. Next, I'll pass it either to you, Carrie, or to Lacey for adopting a code of conduct for elected and appointed officials.
Yeah, Lacey's going to present this one to council, so I'll turn it over to Lacey. Lacey, take it away.
Wonderful. Good evening. Lacey Lewis, Senior Management Analyst in Admin Services. I'm here to present to you the Code of Conduct for elected and appointed officials. The city does not currently have an official code of conduct, and it was a part of the city's 2023 work plan to develop one. The Code of Conduct is an aspirational document intended to serve as a framework for decorum between individual members and the elected body as a whole. And it's going to serve as supplement to the municipal code that applies to all members of city council and boards and commissions. The proposed code encourages the highest standards of behavior and provides guidelines for officials during meetings as well as interactions with each other and city staff. It's not intended to limit the legal authority of city council or boards and commissions, but to reinforce the expectation that elected and appointed officials are to treat each other, staff, and the general public with dignity, respect, and fairness. Elected and appointed officials are going to be expected to adhere to the code of conduct and will be asked to sign an acknowledgement that they understand it and will abide by its provisions. That's all I got.
You got it. Okay, sorry. I was like, and, okay. Carrie, yeah.
So council, the hope is that tonight that you will actually adopt the code of conduct. In contrast to the code of ethics and the proposed amended rules of procedure, which are for discussion tonight and will be brought back to you on April 18th. So for tonight, it's a fairly brief document, but we think it's a very powerful aspirational document.
Great, thank you. Council, any comments, questions, or a motion? All right, well, I move, oh, go ahead. No, you go. Yeah, you go. Yeah, okay. All right, I move to approve. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for your work on this, Carrie. I am happy to see the code of conduct. I am disappointed that there is no enforcement mechanism, and I have talked to the city manager about this. We can't enforce, behavior other than what is kind of the basic things that have already been in our council rules, which is, we can reprimand, we can censure, but I mean, I would have liked to have seen a fine, but that doesn't seem possible. And we have that already in our guidelines, and it hasn't worked in the past. And so I am still concerned that this isn't going to work in the future. There, in my opinion, just needs to be more accountability, self-accountability by the people that are currently on council. I shouldn't have to come here and sit and be concerned that I will be intimidated or I would be bullied or even threatened here. So while I'm happy to have this code of conduct, I am still dismayed and a little disappointed that there isn't a stronger enforcement policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. All right. I move to approve the Code of Conduct, Resolution 2023-1004.
Second.
All right, any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right, next is our Code of Ethics. I think that goes to you, Carrie.
It does. Good evening, Mayor, Council, and everyone. I'm Carrie Sand with Ogden Murphy Wallace. I serve as your city attorney. And as part of your 2023 work plan, you've been expecting this Code of Ethics. Here we are at the start of Q2, right on schedule. And I wanted to lay the groundwork for this discussion in follow-up of the retreat where we started the discussion back on January 28th. That's been almost 2 months ago, hard to believe. But we started the discussion about these Code of Ethics in addition to the Code of Conduct, which you just adopted, thank you, and also talked about some potential amendments to your rules of procedure, which I'll be presenting on next. But one of the things I think I mentioned at the retreat is that other cities have already adopted a Code of Ethics, and this one is heavily modeled after Kirkland and Mercer Island's codes. So if you look at those codes, you'll see a lot of parallels, and I'm happy to point out the differences between what's before you proposed for Sammamish compared to the Mercer Island and Kirkland examples that we used very much as, I would say, a foundational document. Another thing I want to point out is the real impetus for this, the catalyst for this, was the fact that we do have a Code of Ethics for municipal officers in state law that's codified in Chapter 4223 of the RCW, but that's really focused on financial interests in contracts. In Section 070, there's some prohibited conduct listed, but it doesn't take a deep dive into conflicts of interests and some other areas where we felt it would be helpful to supplement state law. And so that's what this code does. It also really supplements regarding process, how a complaint will be processed. And then at a high level, it does also propose to appoint an ethics officer. And I recall talking about this at our retreat. And we think the real benefit of that is that someone who is neutral outside the organization, familiar with codes of ethics and how to apply them. And so we did inquire of Mercer Island and found out that they contract with an attorney who also is serving many times as defense counsel through WCIA, so we're familiar with him. His name's Jeremy Cullimer. He works at Keating, Buckland, and McCormick. He said he does have capacity, and so he's someone that we, for example, could contract with as an ethics officer. But we also recommended having a hearing examiner, not our current hearing examiner, because he specializes in land use matters and land use code, and we would want someone who is familiar with due process concepts and rules of evidence. Again, this is supposed to be an informal proceeding. That said, you still want someone who's familiar with due process and can ensure that everyone is receiving the due process to which they're entitled. But we do recommend contracting with someone to serve as a hearing examiner. We can do that on an ad hoc basis. This is not something that, is going to become an FTE, for example. We sure hope not. Anyhow, so one of the things I also wanted to mention again is that this is really intended tonight to receive your feedback, solicit discussion, and we're going to return on April 18th. I'm aware of the hour. In fact, under rules of procedure, we're almost to the time of making a motion and our hour of adjournment at 10 p.m., which we know we can extend, but just wanted to be really mindful of your time and also encourage you to submit comments to me via email by this Friday. If something occurs to you after the meeting and you say, oh, I would like to potentially have another piece added to this Code of Ethics. But kind of an overarching housekeeping issue that I wanted to bring to your attention. Other cities have adopted their Code of Ethics by ordinance and codified it within their municipal or city code. This right now is structured more like a policy adopted by resolution. Either way is perfectly fine. I just wanted to point that out in case you have a preference, because it's something we can easily pivot and instead have it be an ordinance and codified in your Sammamish Municipal Code. I would recommend that it live in Title II, Administration and Personnel, and we could either put it at the end as the newest section 2.85 next in the series. And I'm not sure how the clerk's office feels about this or code publishing, but there's also an available spot in chapter 2.25, which was repealed previously. In any event, that's a housekeeping issue, but do be thinking about if you want this adopted via resolution as a policy, or if you would rather see it codified in the SMC. And again, I recommend it be placed in Title II. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and provide a quick overview. Of course, it contains a purpose and intent section, and it does require a signed acknowledgement. We want everyone to acknowledge in writing that they have read it, they understand it, and they agree to abide by it. So a signed acknowledgement will be required. We do have certain key terms defined in Section 2, and then our Section 3 policy, it really does mirror what Kirkland and Mercer Island call prohibited conduct. But we wanted to go further, and we wanted to start by first talking about some core values, ethical principles, and then we go into trying to establish prohibited conduct, and we try to provide some more elaboration on gifts and favors. Obviously, you should receive no gifts, especially if it's intended to influence you in your official duties. We do make minor de minimis exceptions for things like pens and, very small things that, frankly, are kind of customary, and it would be socially awkward to decline. No, I'm not going to take this pen from you, right? So it gets a little awkward. So we said, okay, you can take that, because we would all presume a pen is not going to influence your official duties. So this is all fleshed out in 3.3, and then we've got further prohibitions fleshed out in 3.4, use of property, confidentiality. We've got the hyperlink to the RCW that also talks about your duty to maintain confidentiality. We do want this to be user-friendly, so where appropriate, we added hyperlinks for your ease of use, and also the ease of use of all of the appointed members of boards and commissions, because this applies to them as well. In 3.6, this is a area where we did spend a lot of time, and compared to our model codes of Mercer Island and Kirkland, we tried to get into greater detail about conflict of interest and what limited exceptions might exist. We also require disclosure. In other words, if you think you have a conflict of interest about something, we really want that disclosed. And we want to also provide people an opportunity to seek an advisory opinion. That's something that's also codified in Kirkland and Mercer Islands. We think that's a really good idea. And so if you have any question, definitely reach out to me, reach out to the ethics officer. You can actually, there's a process in here for an advisory opinion. We do have a nepotism provision, anti-nepotism. We have provisions regarding political activities and how, of course, you do not, no elected official, no appointed member of any board or commission forfeits their ability to engage in political activities. You just can't use city resources to do it. And you also need to do it on your private time. And we have provisions regarding improper use of your position and improper use of city personnel. So, I think so much of this is obvious, but we wanted to capture because we really want everyone to be held to what we think is a really high level of accountability for ethical standards. So no, I will not be picking up your dry cleaning. No, I'm kidding. I'm teasing you. Okay, so in section 4 is our complaint process, but the codes for Mercer Island and Kirkland, they have a longer heading: complaints, investigations, hearings, and enforcement. Our complaint process does encompass all of those things, so we can certainly expand that heading if you prefer. Again, it starts off with advisory opinions and how we want to encourage people asking for essentially guidance rather than finding themselves in an awkward spot later. So we just think that that's a really important tool to seek guidance. Every complaint regarding an alleged violation of the Code of Ethics must be put in writing. That is really important. It's important because when we receive any other complaint in any other formal setting, whether it's a claim for damages form, a complaint to initiate a lawsuit, it's just really helpful for the complainant to be required to organize their thoughts and put them in writing. It helps people, the ethics officer in particular, understand, what's going on here, what's the nature of this situation. There will be a finding of sufficiency that the ethics officer shall make a determination of sufficiency within 30 calendar days. In other words, it could be possible that the issue is more of an interpersonal issue and not really a Code of Ethics issue. So that is possible, and that's why there's this finding of sufficiency. Is it rising to the level of violating potentially this Code of Ethics, or is it really just something else? Except as provided by law, because of course we have to follow state law regarding the Public Records Act, but we will try to maintain confidentiality as best as we can, just to try to really safeguard anyone who's involved in this process and have it be a process that has a lot of integrity. But again, if someone makes a records request, we will comply with state law and fulfill that. If the complaint is not sufficient, or if it has too little detail, or if it is clear that a violation has or has not occurred, but appropriate actions have been taken to fully address it, then the complaint could be dismissed. Again, this is a determination to be made by the ethics officer. And then there's notice provisions, because again, we are wanting to ensure that due process is afforded to anybody who must go through this process. We do have a stipulation provision, so in lieu of a hearing, the ethics officer and the official complained against, they may jointly submit a recommended stipulation to the council. And that's sort of like, for lack of a better analogy, a plea bargain, if you will. It's like, okay, I think I violated this, but I'm so sorry. I can assure you it won't happen again. I understand the rules, and I am willing to follow whatever recommended remedy or penalty you have come up with. And it's, like I said, akin, if you will, to like a plea bargain. If instead you want a hearing, the person complained against can ask for a hearing, and we will again have a neutral third-party decision maker who's qualified in these types of matters. And there's a lot of language around not only the conduct of the hearing, but the final decision and recommendation, all intended to ensure due process is afforded. Now, with regard to council action, there was a very intentional decision made that for penalties for noncompliance, and this a little bit goes to what Deputy Mayor Lamb was saying, there's a full spectrum of potential penalties here. There's everything from a do nothing because we're going to give you a free pass this time, depending again on the severity, the circumstances, the totality, to, we're going to maybe censure in addition to removal from, if it's a board or commission member, removal from the board or commission potentially. If it's a council member, removal from council member appointments. It could be removal of the mayor or deputy mayor appointment. And then we do have a civil penalty provision in here that I wanted to call to your attention. Again, following up on what I just heard Deputy Mayor Lamb say, it does say a civil penalty of up to $1,000. I leave it to the council whether you think that that is a sufficiently high penalty, if you think that would serve not only as a penalty, but a deterrent. So if you want to discuss that tonight, I would welcome feedback on that, or you can again email me. But again, I would hope that for something as important as that, we would discuss it in open session tonight, because I think that's going to be an important piece. And again, we'll have opportunity for more discussion on the 18th when this comes back to you for hopeful adoption. So there's an appeal provision, of course, protection against retaliation. No one should be retaliated against for bringing forward any kind of complaint with an ethics officer. We want to affirmatively acknowledge our duties under the Public Records Act, so there's a provision for that. There's a potential provision to recover attorney's fees. That's allowed if the complaint against you is dismissed. So I wanted to point that out. That's in 4.15. And then there are limitations. Complaints based on this code may only be brought against current elected officials and appointed members and must be submitted within 2 years from the date of the alleged violation. I will tell you that the time frame, 2 years, is what we thought was more appropriate, because we did note that I believe it was Kirkland allowed for 3 years, and we just felt that that was allowing things to get a little stale as far as evidence and things like that. So we wanted to encourage 2 years for more prompt action. If council wants, we can change it to 1 year. Again, there's some flexibility in this code that we've brought to you, but I would say that overall, this code represents a huge supplementation of state law. It's a big step forward, considering that the city didn't have any code of ethics to date. And so I welcome your feedback, and at this time, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Yeah, this looks great. Thank you so much. Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, thank you. I think this is really awesome. I did send you and Scott a couple of questions, clarifying questions yesterday, but maybe got lost in the email. One was on 3.4.2, talking about from the time that a council member declares or publicly states that they intend to run for re-election until the conclusion of the election. If someone is distributing materials that has, you know, something about their election information on it, on city property, but they haven't officially declared, is the distribution of such a document in and of itself a declaration, or is that something separate?
Thank you for that question. I think that that really does depend on the circumstances, because, for example, it could be possible that that was just an oversight. I don't know the exact circumstances, but in the hypothetical you've given, it seems like it is an intent to publicly declare an intent to run for re-election. It's something that, if a complaint were put in writing, that the ethics officer would really want to look at the exact facts and circumstances. As we all know, the deadline for filing is, I believe, in May. But that said, someone could announce way ahead of that and early, and it's just one of those hypotheticals that I can't give you a specific answer, but I understand why you're bringing it forward, because it would be something that I think would be a legitimate complaint for an ethics officer to then determine the sufficiency of, and perhaps move it forward depending on what else is involved.
Okay, and then also the second question was, can council members use campaign logos in conjunction with council communication activities?
Campaigning is supposed to be separate. So you're supposed to keep your regular day-to-day council duties separate from your campaigning. And so I would say, in my view, based on PDC guidance that I'm familiar with from the Public Disclosure Commission, you are not supposed to do that.
Okay. And so those would just be things that, like, you don't feel like we have to add to this. It would just be something, if you had a question, you would submit that to the ethics officer and to clarify.
Yes, you could seek an advisory opinion about that, but that latter example that you gave, in my view, is something that is pretty widely documented in the Public Disclosure Commission guidelines and on their website. I feel like even I could answer that, but there are times when I think it would just be best to go to the ethics officer.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, council? Because I think this is coming back on the consent calendar.
Well, perhaps. I mean,
Okay.
it can always get pulled off of consent if there's a lot of energy around it. But, you know, is there any feedback, for example, on the civil penalty? the time frame within which you need to bring forward a complaint.
Both of those to me sound great. Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, I was just curious, you said you picked 2 because you didn't want it to be too stale, but you said Kirkland had 3. Do we understand why they chose 3?
I don't understand exactly why. They adopted theirs in 2012, so kudos to Kirkland. They were an early adopter of a code of ethics, I mean, at least from some of the ones I've seen. And I don't know why they chose 3 years, but I would be concerned about evidence getting stale.
I guess the one thing that I think about, right, is like 2 years kind of mirrors the election cycles, so I don't know if that kind of gives people a little more overlap, that may be why they chose 3. I don't know.
I really don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Councilmember O'Farrell?
I'm okay with the 2 years and the $1,000 fine. I'm okay with those.
Councilmember Treen?
Clarification on 3.6.6, family members of council members. Clearly, no council member can appoint a member of their family to the type of board because it's the whole council that appoints. So do you want to just change that to say that no council member can nominate a family member? Since that's really what this is going after?
I really appreciate that point, Councilmember Treen. I think what we could do is refine the language to be no council member shall nominate or vote on a member of their family, because
Yeah, I don't agree with that because that's not law, but if you want to put that in as a council ethics thing, I don't understand where that fits into nepotism if you have qualified family members who are qualified to serve on a board or a multi-member body within the city.
well, I believe this provision is intending to allow the disclosure of the familial relationship as that term is defined. And you'll see that family member, as we've defined it, includes a domestic partner or significant other. And we are intending that not only that be disclosed, but that you recuse yourself. Because we view it as frankly showing favoritism in the sense of the word nepotism, where you're favoring
That's how you guys
your
see it?
family member over someone else.
All right, thank you for the clarification on that. Appreciate it.
Well, and I appreciate your comment about the phrasing used there. And I think if I get head nods of consensus from the council, we're going to change it to shall nominate or vote on, if people agree with that. I'm seeing some head nods. Okay. Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Lamb?
Oh, I just wanted to say I'm good with the 2 years and the $1,000 as well.
Thank you.
Councilmember Andapure?
Thank you. Is that, so for the $1,000, is that a max limit or is it per infraction that it'll be $1,000?
It is phrased in 4.11.9 as a civil penalty of up to 1,000. So council in its discretion could lower the number.
Thank you.
Councilmember Treen?
Yeah, is this going to be retro?
No. No, it won't be retro. It will be prospective from the date of adoption. And if it is a resolution and adopted in policy form as presented in your packet tonight, then it would be effective on passage. But if instead you would prefer, and that's something I need your feedback on, if you would prefer that it be codified in your Sammamish Municipal Code, then it would not be effective until 5 days after publication.
Thank you.
So that's a great segue, though. Can I get feedback from the council on if you'd like this to be in the SMC and adopted by ordinance, or if you're good with it adopted by resolution as a policy?
So if we incorporate it into our SMC, like the 5 days, is that like a public hearing that you need or publication?
No, that's actually a standard rule. All ordinances, unless they're adopted on an emergency basis, I mean, there's always some exceptions, but typically ordinances do not go into effect until 5 days after publication in the city's official newspaper.
Okay, so they have to be published. So I mean, I think my preference would be to adopt it into the SMC. So it's more, feels more permanent.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to understand like the pros and cons of the code versus procedure. Like it does seem a lot more official in the code, which I do like, but does it really have any material effect on the ability to change it or anything, or its enforceability or anything like that?
No, it would always have to go to council for amendment because, as you know, that's how even policies adopted through resolution work. I do think it would be more transparent if it were in your code because it would be easier for members of the general public to find it. Sometimes people aren't aware of what they don't even know exists. And so if it's a policy adopted by resolution, I think it will be less transparent, frankly.
Okay.
So with that, I mean,
And I'm in favor of the code.
I do recommend, now that we're having this conversation, that we put it in the SMC. So I see head nods. If you want to make a formal motion for that, that would be fine too. But I'm seeing majority consensus with the head nods.
Do you want a motion?
Sure.
Okay, then I move that upon that we amend the information here, that when it comes back, it be formally adopted as code.
Second.
I did have one question. You're going to choose where it goes. We don't need to talk about it in this.
No, that's truly housekeeping,
Okay,
whether it's in Chapter 225 or 285. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Councilmember Treen?
Can restate the motion, please?
Yeah, I guess I was a little fuzzy there. When adopted, this will be adopted in the SMC.
Thank you.
All right. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? All right. Great.
Okay, so next time you see this in your packet for the next regular meeting on April 18th, it will be in the form of an ordinance, and it will, upon being effective, be codified. Thank you.
Great. So before we move to the next one, I know we need to extend, I don't know how long. We anticipate number 11, and I think we need to talk about consent item number 3, so.
I move we extend to 10:30.
Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
All right, 10:30. All right, Carrie.
Thank you. Good evening again. So now we're on item 11, revising the rules of procedure for the City Council. I think this will go fairly quickly because we had a robust discussion during the January 28th council retreat. And the changes are highlighted on the first page of your agenda bill. These items 1 through 7. We did change pronouns to be gender neutral. There was a lot of his, him, male pronouns, and they are now gender neutral. And that was at the suggestion of Councilmember Indepore. And then Mayor Clark wanted citizen change to resident, so we've made those changes. Under number 2, we've added Public Records Act compliance, and that was based on City of Tukwala's provision. And that's now in 2.4. You have a new 2.8 that is not listed here, and that heading is official correspondence. And so there'll be a little bit more discussion on that in just a second. In 3.4.5, we have a new provision regarding electronic devices during meetings, trying to disallow or prohibit the use of electronic devices where you're communicating with each other during meetings. We have a new consequences provision for accountability to adhere to these rules. And we have a new process for proclamations. It's really just fleshing out our current proclamation process. There is kind of this unwritten rule that the clerk's office has pointed out of 2 per meeting, but again, we can discuss that more. And then we've got a no surprise rule that is trying to take out our overly restrictive provisions that are in our current rules regarding so-called emergency 3-hour rule and all that kind of stuff. It's really just a more courtesy-driven rule to ensure that there is a level playing field of information, no surprises, and trying to make it easier for a last-minute agenda amendment if needed. And then we finally have a new provision regarding order of business. I will add that, again, this is for discussion tonight. This will be back before you on the 18th of April. Based on the discussion tonight, we will do some housekeeping changes, and when you see it next, it will have a table of contents, and when it's published, it will have bookmarks, and it will hopefully be more user-friendly because I myself scramble through it a lot of times and can't find things. So this is intended to hopefully make it easier to use. So with that, this, as you know, is adopted by resolution. That's historically how the city's done it. And I wanted to just call out the first major substantive change on page, well, in my version, it's on page 4 of the Rules of Procedure, and that's the Public Records Act compliance provision in 2.4. I believe all of you have seen this previously. We talked about this during the retreat. If there's any questions, feel free to interrupt me. You don't have to hold your questions to the end. On the next page in 2.8, there's a proposed new provision regarding official correspondence from the Sammamish City Council. And it shall be presented at a council meeting and approved by motion before it is distributed whenever feasible. However, when it must be distributed sooner than the next council meeting, the correspondence will be distributed and then added to the next council meeting agenda as a report. This is intended so that council knows that it happened, but I wanted to call this to your attention. This wasn't discussed at the retreat, and it's something that is a new addition, and wanted to get your feedback on this and if you have any changes to this. The next substantive change is in 3.4.5, electronic devices during meetings. This was borrowed from the Issaquah Rules of Procedure, you might recall. And it's basically saying that council members should limit the use of electronic devices to only accessing agenda materials and other agenda-related information during meetings, and not communicate with each other electronically or through social media during meetings. This is, of course, part of your council goal of trust and transparency. And then the next new section is in 3.4.7, consequences. This is borrowed from Tacoma. We discussed this at the retreat, and the whole point of this is to acknowledge that you have the power to impose consequences on your own members, short of removal of office, of course, for violation of these council rules of procedures or state law. So it's spelled out here. It's fairly succinct and short. Again, welcome your feedback on this. In 3.6 on that same page is the public request for proclamations, and these are guidelines. And I understand the city clerk does circulate an annual proclamation schedule. But that said, there are other considerations listed here for when proclamations should be requested, and it is noted that it should be at least 2 weeks in advance of the requested council meeting. And the mayor, deputy mayor, city manager, and our staff designee will determine if the proposed proclamation meets the intent of this policy. Council, of course, retains the right to limit the number of proclamations at a council meeting and to modify, edit, or otherwise amend the proposed proclamation. And council decides if it will or will not be issued. And once approved, the proclamation will be included on the appropriate council agenda. They often coincide with a particular month, as you know, highlighting awareness for various issues. And if not approved, the requester will be notified of the decision and the reasons for the decision to not approve a proclamation request. The next,
I'm sorry, I have a quick question. On
Sorry,
that.
I do have Councilmember Ndapure first. I didn't know if.
Oh, no, sorry.
Yeah, I don't know, Carrie, do you have some more to go through, and do you want us to save our questions for last, or?
Please go ahead, and if it's about proclamations, it's very timely.
Actually, it was not about proclamations,
Oh,
about
okay.
electronic devices.
Sure.
So I think the 3.4.5, it says, as you mentioned, council members should limit their use of electronic devices to access the agenda materials and other agenda-related materials during information. So for example, if we're talking about, I'll just state proclamations, and I want to do a quick research on some other cities on how they're doing their proclamations or whatever, is that considered acceptable? Is that
Yes.
something still related?
Yes, that is related, that is acceptable. What we're trying to expressly disallow is council members communicating with each other electronically or through social media during meetings, because we want you to talk amongst or talk with yourselves in open session so that the public knows exactly what you're discussing and you're not communicating through side channels.
Right. So another one on that, and I don't know if it's here or if it was above. So there is one for electronic items where it says, use of, it's under 2.4. Council members should send and receive messages related to city business through city's email system. And there is another one for devices used. What if I have my personal device and but I'm logging into my city email through my personal device? Is that considered acceptable? Is it not acceptable?
Well, I believe if you're using your city account, but through your personal device, then everything you're doing through your city account is being captured on the city server. So that's acceptable.
That's acceptable. Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, on the proclamations, I'm really happy to see this added. I was just curious, will the entire council be notified if things are submitted and not allowed? Just so we're aware of kind of what's coming in, or could we add that?
I think that if you want to add that, and there's council consensus for that add, that would be really helpful clarification.
So, Councilmember Stewart, I think I see one like H where it says, if not approved, the requester will be notified. Are you saying the requester and the city council will be notified?
Yeah, because it's
that
fine
makes
that the mayor and deputy mayor and all are making decisions, but that way we're just aware that somebody submitted something and it was disapproved.
I think it makes
And then
sense.
one further clarification, so it'll be at least 2 weeks prior to a meeting, which is helpful, so there's time. Will the entirety of the council get it as soon as it's submitted, so that if we do feel the need to make edits, there's time before it's published publicly?
We usually include them in the draft that goes out. That's just to council.
Okay.
So you get a chance
So
to look at them.
Okay. So that would fall in that window. So if it came in after the draft was published, then we would wait till the next meeting for that proclamation to come up.
Yes, because that would be less than 2 weeks.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And if I may get clarification, if there's council consensus to modify item H under 3.6 to say, if not approved, the requester and the council will be notified of the decision and the reasons for the decision. Head nods for that. Everyone good with that? Okay, great. Okay, so the next substantive change is the no surprise rule. I touched on that at the beginning of my remarks. That's on the top of page 14. And it basically is modeled after what Issaquah had, which I thought was a lot less restrictive than our current rules related to last minute emergency changes, which were somewhat onerous. And so it just talks about council members should use best efforts to contact the mayor or city council to advise of emerging issues. B, provide staff advance notice of any questions or concerns they may have on agenda items prior to a public meeting if possible to allow for staff preparation. Staff responses to such requests will be provided to the full council. And C, provide staff and city council advance notice if planning to propose substantial amendments or revisions to any agenda items. And this is just a courtesy to your fellow council colleagues as well as to staff so that we can come to these meetings and be as prepared as possible to be as productive, efficient, and effective as possible. dare I say, this brings us to the end of these. In 4.1.4, order of business, we have spelled out the order of business. This does follow our usual order of business in our typical regular meeting agendas. And lastly, we did add some criteria for consent calendar items. Those are in no particular order, but you'll see in 4.1.5, we've got A through E as just examples of the types of matters that are often seen on the consent calendar. They've often previously been discussed with the council based on information delivered to members of the council, and they don't require further explanation, or they're so routine in nature that passage is likely. So with that, are there any other questions or comments, feedback? Remember, we'll never be done with our rules. These are living, breathing rules. They are not meant to be parked on a shelf gathering dust. And so we'll have this chance probably annually to go over our rules and make other edits and fine tune the rules to, again, suit your preferences.
Or Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, one other question, just on voting, like we have our voting on mayor and deputy mayor, which is great. There's a section in there about nominating people for boards and commissions. I kind of thought we wanted to add in here what the procedures would be for voting on boards and commissions so that we don't have to have that discussion every time we have to do a board and commission vote, just to save ourselves some time and agony.
Yeah, thank you for that, Councilmember Stewart. And you did bring that up during the retreat. I remember that. So we do have the clerk's office's prepared procedures for handling the process for appointing the mayor and deputy mayor, like you noted. And so rather than live in these rules, I'm wondering if the clerk's office would be amenable to creating something for filling vacancies on boards and commissions. Because I agree with the overarching comment that we want to streamline this and have it be a predictable process that can be replicated again and again.
I just want to mention that we've already formatted a procedure for the commissions, and Krista will be fine-tuning it a little bit further, but we'll have that as our permanent procedure.
Excellent. I love that.
And if I may follow up on that, the procedure we just went through for the recent Arts and Beaver Lake Management Board, that was the same as it was earlier when we did the initial appointments for the year. So we try that's essentially what Chris is going to be spelling out, but that's how we are planning on moving forward.
Excellent. Thank you. I just don't want to ever have to have that discussion again.
Yeah, and again, that's why they weren't here, because I knew the clerk's office was working on that. So same with the mayor, deputy mayor, those procedures will live outside your council rules of procedure, but they are going to be written. And so again, we don't have to replicate it over and over, but instead just follow the standard process.
Is there any advantage to having them published somewhere, again, just for transparency's sake, so that the public doesn't feel like we're kind of changing anything up on them? I don't know.
We could have them added to our commission page.
Perfect.
As a procedure for.
I think that would be great. Yeah. Thank you.
So is there any reason not to just vote on this? You just want to give us a chance?
Well,
you need a table of contents. Okay,
I
my
mean,
bad.
You could, if you want, vote on it tonight, but I do intend to, like I said, add the table of contents.
Pretty.
And yeah.
We hear you. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. No, I know. Yeah. All right. Does anyone have a question or any comments on that? Scott.
Mayor, if I may just clarify, I think based on the feedback tonight, in particular, the council rules can come back on consent. So that's one of those areas where it makes sense if there's no further, other than the table of contents, if there's no other changes, then we can say, council already discussed it, here's the final product.
Can't wait for that table of contents. So excited. Yeah. All righty. Next, we will move to consent item number 3. Speaking of consent calendar. Scott, I don't know if you want to take this, or Amy, if you want to start it off. And thank you, Carrie. These are beautiful.
I can start. So I'm pulling this because I'm pulling this line item number 3. It is approval for the contract supplemental agreement for the communications program consultant services. And I'm pulling this, it's for $39,500. I don't believe this is the best use of city funds. This supplement would cover for 2 more months, and it's for somebody that's working part-time. And also the new communications manager, a new staff person, will start May 1st. So I would much rather prefer and rather see this $39,500 applied to somebody that could work under the new communications manager at a lower cost. I just don't believe that for a couple months' work that this is a good use of our spend.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate that, Deputy Mayor, and understand one of the things, and I apologize if I haven't been clear on this, one of the things that this contract has been covering is also doing website support, and not back end, but the communications version of the website, which is making sure that all the pages have the same voice and going in and cleaning up. One of the things that was pointed out to me is that normal business websites are 15 to 20 pages long. The city's is about 850, given all of our projects and departments and everything else. And so one of the things that about 40% of the dollars that have been going to that contract have been going to just website support to make sure that all of our pages are up to date. And we really don't have anyone else in-house that has the expertise to do that. So the communications portion of her contract, she's been very steady with, and then the website support has been the piece that's been on top of that. She offered to do that as a subcontract, which I thought was effective for the city rather than going out separately. And so that's why I authorized that previously. And so that's what this contract reflects, some more continued website support along with communication support. We have a month to go before the new person starts, and then there will be some transition time necessary. And at that point, we will reevaluate how we're splitting things out and how much workload there is to get a better sense of how we do this moving forward.
Councilmember Howe?
Is there acceptance criteria for the website? So I'm assuming that you haven't signed off on the website then because this work is still being done. So I'm assuming this takes you to acceptance.
Acceptance, can you clarify?
Well, you're talking about that the redirects and so forth haven't been completed.
Oh, correct.
Necessarily. So
Yeah.
you're not really done, is I guess my point. I understand Amy's point well, and I also am used to spending a lot of money on websites to clean it up. And do they have a process for us that if you find something, for example, you can go back to them and say, well, this redirect doesn't work, this is a 404.
Yeah, that's been an all hands on deck effort to try to get at all of those sort of collectively. We're trying to make sure that we're updating everything. I'll be perfectly clear, when we launched the new website, we tried to get as much done as possible, but we were not completely done at that point in time.
Yeah, fully accept that and understand that.
So that process is ongoing. I would expect we probably have another couple of months of that to really get us to a good place.
And that's where some of that $39,000 goes to, correct?
Correct.
Right. For how many, do you have any idea how many people are working on it?
I believe there's a couple of people. Mike is on the line with us. Mike, do you have insight into that?
There's one main subcontractor working with us, and then there's a second subcontractor that's also helping, but it's primarily one person.
Okay. And out of curiosity, does this cover SEO work as well?
Yes, we didn't have any SEO fields on the back end. SEO means search engine optimization. We didn't have those fields on our old site, and it was created for our new site. So that's part of their process is going through and making sure those fields are completed on our new content, as well as adding like alternative text to photos and things like that.
Yeah, that's an extensive process. That really does take the time, and it takes the capital.
Deputy Mayor Lamb?
So I appreciate understanding that some of this stuff is for the website. I guess what would be really helpful is to know how much we are actually paying per dollar for the web services, because right now the contractor is getting paid $155, and I don't think that that's an appropriate amount that we should be paying for somebody that's doing really simple web updates like that. So the request is for $39,500. I'd like to see like how much the hourly rate is and see where we can go from there.
Councilmember Stewart?
Yeah, I'm sorry, Scott, did I miss? So I don't understand why we have a communications vendor doing this work when we hired a vendor to do the website. Like, the website contract should have handled all of this. Like, this is pretty basic website conversion activity, so why is this a separate cost that we're incurring as opposed to the contract for the people who did this work?
Thank you for the question, Councilmember. I want to be, and I did ask about this. The contractor was building the back ends of the actual technical part of the website. This is our content on the website.
But redirects is part of your back end. Like, that should be covered by the contractor.
I appreciate that, Councilmember, and like I said, we asked the contractor to change a number of times as we were going through the process. I asked for things to be changed because I felt that they would be more transparent and to get us up to speed. So we made a number of changes to that contract, and that contract, that the redirect part is still an ongoing piece of it. But I think in terms of the content and those pieces, that's the separation that I would make between what's being proposed in this contract and what the back-end consultant was doing for building the new website.
So the consultant is no longer helping with the redirects. That's all on staff and this communications vendor at this point.
I would have to double check on that. I know D2 is the consultant on the back end, and they're still wrapping up a few things on that one. And I think that our IT folks are helping as well to make sure that we get through all those. There are quite a few of them, and we're trying to go through and systematically fix all of those. And so sometimes we don't know them until we come on, till they get pointed out. So we're trying to we are asking all of our departments to go through and check their websites and try everything to make sure that they work.
Yeah, I just feel bad that that burden's falling on staff. I feel like that's pretty base. That should be part of that conversion from the contractor. But
So I actually would like to approve this. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts or questions, but I'd like to make a motion on this. All right, so I move to approve the supplemental agreement for our communications program consultant services.
Second.
All right, any other thoughts, questions? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Nay.
Nay.
Is that 2?
nay.
3? So 4-3. Okay. Did you get that? Okay, cool. All righty. So for council reports or city manager report, did you have anything, Scott?
Thank you, Mary. I think we've covered everything tonight.
Cool. I did want to mention, it's kind of late, but King County Council member Sarah Perry is hosting a town hall in our city at the library this Thursday, April 6th at 6:30 p.m. Councilmember Brenda Pure?
Sorry. I had a quick question for the city manager about the rent freeze that was requested by CWU. All this conversation about land use kind of reminded me of that. And I was like, what did we end up doing with that?
We're still working through that, Councilmember.
Perfect.
Thank you for the
Thank
question.
you.
That's,
Thanks.
it's an ongoing process.
Thanks.
All right, does anyone else have anything verbal or other? Councilmember Howe?
Just really quickly, Director David Pyle and I attended a meeting of the CDBG BG, which is the, what is it, the Community Development Grant process. So
Block grant process, yeah.
We got an update on just because we're part of ARCH and able to get access to some funds. There is an opportunity for some grants opening up in the April timeframe. They're small grants, they're not large, but they could fund a really interesting program like home repair or something along those lines. The challenge will be the fact that we need to come up with something pretty quickly if we're going to apply for it. And Sammamish has never gotten one of these. And I actually think we'd be in a very good position to actually be able to get this. This is a HUD King County thing that, because I'm part of the GRC, that we managed to worm our way into. So we'll see if we can actually get something going there.
That's great. Thank you. Anyone else? Would anyone like to make that last motion?
I move to adjourn.
Second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All righty. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. We are adjourned.